all over the place. No idea which chat to look at. No idea. On Twitter. Some on YouTube. What song is this? It's like from Command and Conquer or something. It's a really old song. I'm gonna be. Don't worry. I'm gonna be debunking the anti-vax whoever that is. There even a chat on Twitter? They can like tweet reply or something. I don't know. Will you ever stream with Dawson? Having our second born tomorrow, Ryan. Congratulations. Power Man in the Is Ryan gonna read YouTube Odyssey chat? I'll go back and forth and try to read what I can. All right. So I don't know what I wanted to talk about today a little bit is just with the mainly I had like a big like autistic sort of rambly free association-y thing about like religions coming about almost I've come to the position that religion has come about almost exclusively primarily top down. Not that the initial guru wasn't some rando, but that they are imposed on most people. Most people end up embracing a religion unless you're like really part of like the initial core followers. They end up embracing a religion from the top down, from some sort of state entity makes you embrace the religion. But what I've wanted to look at here is that a while back, like the new Pfizer Veritas thing kind of answered something that I thought that was very curious to me for a while. And so a while back, I made a video called the COVID program. It's like an hour long. And there's also the COVID program part 2, where I say a bunch of other things that isn't as well edited and stuff. But so the first thing that, and this is kind of a little bit of a retread, so bear with me. Let me do the screen thing. Yeah, how do I do it? Safe. Okay. So these are the Google Trends. Because one thing back in 2018, well, towards the middle, towards the end of 2018, I noticed, just like my own noticing, I noticed a massive increase in like anti-vax anti-vaxxer media content. Like Family Guy did a thing on anti-vaxxers, a bunch of other sitcoms like that. I would see like little clips of sitcoms, and they're talking about the dreaded anti-vaxxer and how bad anti-vaxxers are. And was that just me, or did that actually happen? Well, I can't canvass like all media, like all the news sites. That I just sort of had an impression. Wow, they're really going after these anti-vaxxers out of the blue. Like, what? Like, where does this come from? Like, this, like, anti-vaxxers have been around like forever, and only now suddenly, back in like well, we can see sort of when it happened, when the whole anti-vaxxer thing became like a real big shindig. And so that's kind of odd. So you had, and this is of course search interest, and I'm using search interest as kind of a proxy for media portrayal. And I think that's fair. I think that if people are like mass searching like anti-vaxxer, like all these things, um when they weren't before, there's a little thing back in June of 2018, right? But then it really started picking up towards the end of 2018 and into early 2019. So so that was kind of weird. That was always kind of a weird thing for me. And then of course once you had the 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 Wuhan flu, then it starts to pick up again. But this is what's weird. It's this ridge that's really weird. This is less weird. This is obviously, you know, contempt. This is obviously, there's things going on in the real world that would cause people to look into that. But here is where it's weird. This is astroturfed. This over here, this is less astroturfed. This is more genuine, I guess. At least regarding events. This is astroturfed. So yeah. Ah, turn off display. So yeah, so another thing is that I guess more like the recap going into eventually what we know now. There was an investigation looking at the origin of the virus, showing the case that there was, so there was a whole bunch of things, and this is from what is it? I actually have, I wrote down a few little things here, and then I also have the display here. Uh, yes, it's this. So this is led by science, the COVID-19 origin story select subcommittee, opening remarks by Stephen Quay, and in this he says a few things. Now I actually did like made some little slides to kind of simplify it a little bit. So where are the little slides? Let's see, I have the slideshow. Yes. So anyway, so this is basically his presentation to the Republican Select Subcommittee, whatever. So what he found: none of the 11 patients from the Wuhan market had the earliest COVID-19 strain. See if this works. Oh, look, it pops it up. All four patients with the earliest genetic version of the virus had no contact with the Huanan market. So that's the wet market they're talking about. The first patient from January 2020 with the earliest COVID-19 sequence was treated at a hospital of the Center Theater Command for the PLA, not few the PLA, Chinese Army, roughly 3 kilometers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. None of the environmental specimens in the Huanan had the earliest strain, which means it probably came into the market. Then they went to animal testing. 457 animals from the Huanan market were tested, all found negative for COVID-19. So none of the animals they tested in the market had it. 616 animals from suppliers to the Huanan market were tested, all found negative. 1,086 wild animals of the type found in the market were also tested, all negative. Then I mean, this was a huge operation in China. 80,000 samples tested from 209 species from other markets, farms, and wildlife areas throughout China. A COVID-19 virus was not found in a single specimen. The probability of this for a community-acquired infection is about 1 in 1 million. Then, after testing 9,952 human blood specimens from hospitals, there was not a single case of a COVID-19 in any of the blood donors in December 29th, 2019. It was expected that around 250 would be positive. Because again, if this is a community-acquired infection, it's going to be about before it's even noticed. But this was noticed apparently before it got into anyone who ended up being a blood donor. And he said the possibility of this, Mr. Quay, is about 1 in 1 million. I think he's just saying 1 in 1 million for a rhetorical whatever. The real number is going to be something higher or lower than that. For MERS and SARS-1, the yearly transmissions were mostly animal to human. And for SARS-CoV-2, basically didn't happen at all. So it says 249 cases were examined genetically, and they were all found to be human-to-human transmission. For community-acquired infections, this is the probability of 0.5 to the 249th power, or getting heads on a coin toss 249 times in a row. SARS-CoV-2 was pre-adapted for human-to-human transmission to the very first patient. And this is something that I didn't really understand. I kind of don't quite understand. But this also gets into a little bit of the Pfizer thing. The part of the virus that interacts with humans was 99.5% optimized. SARS-1 was 17% optimized. I don't know what that optimization means, but okay, that's what he said. And that's it. That's the end of the slides. How is my audio? Let me check the chat, people. Okay, so the YouTube people can hear it. I'm also streaming on Twitch because I have like a restream thing, and it lets you stream to a bunch of sites. So I just set up like a Twitch. One viewer on Twitch. That's actually me. There's me watching on Twitch. Hey Ryan, do you read Odyssey? I don't know. The Odyssey has like their own little currency thing. I don't know what that is. But I'll read Odyssey chats once in a while. The audio could be a little bit louder, some people say. Okay, well I think it's easier to turn it down than turn it up for people. So I will raise the audio a little bit. Now. Okay. Too much computer stuff. So basically there's a whole bunch of evidence that it was a lab leak, and that's kind of old news at this point. Retrospectively, I think that seems a lot more likely now. As time goes on, it's retrospectively a lot more plausible that it was a lab leak, that it wasn't natural. Now the thing is, this evidence from from Mr. Quay, I mean, this was back in June of 2021. So all of the in real terms, it was basically predetermined that this was a lab leak, at least by June of 2021, probably well before that as well. So now that we have a pretty good suspicion that Pfizer has been modifying the coronavirus, in retrospect, it kind of makes the initial lab leak and an intentional initial lab leak a lot more plausible. But the on-case evidence, even at the time, it overwhelmingly pointed to a lab leak, even without the more recent revelations. Now, one thing I thought that was so bizarre about the vaccine, first off, was the speed at which it was developed, right? And the speed at which it developed, I mean, that can only imply bad things. So, such as it had been developed so quickly because here's it was developed so quickly because it wasn't actually being developed, right? Which kind of goes back to, which kind of goes back to this, because there's something going on back here, and then the vaccine was developed really, really quickly, like, uh, you know, you know. So that looks kind of odd. What else? Um, what was also bizarre about it, aside from like the clear inherently risky nature of like the mRNA, yeah, we're gonna hijack a few of your cells, mitochondria, to get them to produce this spike protein thing. Aside from just, the inherent, see, to me at the time, like my impression is like that's crazy, the inherent craziness of it on its face. Aside from that, turning your cells into spike protein factory, um, was that the immunity was focused solely on the spike protein, which seems really weird. Like again, see, and it sort of ties into each other, because if the immunity is focusing solely on the spike protein, why would these companies do that? Why would the vaccine companies do that instead of having like a broad, instead of focusing on all parts of the virus? Like, because the way the body naturally develops immunity is it develops immunity against a whole thing, right? And in previous video, I went into like how it does that. Basically, there's the phagocytes that go in and kill the virus and create a whole bunch of little pieces of the virus, and then some other antibodies come in and develop and capture like bits and pieces of the destroyed virus to then get like memory something, and that's how you develop antibodies. Go watch a proper video on that. But basically, your body gets naturally, like in the wild, like if you actually give it like a full living breathing virus, not breathing but living virus, not living either. Neither of those things were true. um, you develop broad-based immunity. So like say a virus has 10 discrete parts, you will develop immunity to all 10 of those parts. And that way, if any one of those parts mutates, then your body still has antibodies to the other 9, right? So why the hell would a company develop a vaccine for just one part of the virus? And you know, and and as it happens, that one part of the virus is this spike protein, which is the thing that also shows the most signs of it being engineered, that it's not natural. So they're developing a vaccine for one part of the virus, the part of the virus that is clearly engineered. No, not you. You. Right? After something was going on back here to get people all amped up on like anti-vax. Anti-vax. So there's all that going on. Now, before the recent Veritas up, where you got the that Pfizer nog come out and say that they were engineering COVID variants to sell more boosters, right, ad infinitum. Um, and that's of course something more horrible than I imagined. That's something that's not considered by most people. Is out of all the rotten things conspiracy theorists say are happening, so like here's an example where the conspiracy theorists underestimated how bad it was, right? If the Pfizer leaks get confirmed, and if they have legs. But anyway, before the Veritas sting, my thinking was that the vaccine makers thought they could provide slam dunk immunity to the virus by merely focusing on the spike protein. And why would they think that? Because, well, because it would make sense for them to think that if they engineered it, right? So, and also from this Quay guy, he noted that the spike protein had some sequences that never occurred in nature, that it was all engineered, which incidentally is also more confirmation that it was a lab leak from the Wuhan lab, if that was at all in doubt. And so my thinking was this: the vaccine makers either worked on the virus or knew guys who worked on the virus, and they quote unquote knew that the spike protein could not mutate on its own. Right? It could not mutate on its own because they've been replicating it trillions and trillions of times, and the spike protein never mutated. Okay. Thus, the jab, which seems stupid to the layman, right, or stupid to a kind of semi-aware layman, they figured would actually work because they designed the virus in such a way that is easy to immunize against. Because there's that one part of the virus that never mutates. They can jab you against the spike protein, and that'll be that. And thus, the traditional time frame for vaccine development wasn't necessary because they didn't need immunity against a whole virus, or if if a vaccine against the common cold is even possible, but just that spike protein, which they thought was incapable of mutating. Okay, so that was my thinking before. Then what I thought happened was a sort of life finds a way situation where the spike protein out in the wild, it mutated, which meant that the narrow immunity from the vaccine didn't work because the spike protein was mutating against all expectations. And so it was kind of like, I was looking at it as, oh, this is like Jurassic Park all over again. And so thus rendering the vaccine that just targeted the spike protein, which could be developed quickly because it only targeted that one spike protein, useless. I also have a suspicion that this vaccine was being developed beforehand, like, but now, as it turns out, Pfizer and who else we don't know. Like the thing about the Pfizer leaks is that could be true of Pfizer, or maybe it's not true of Pfizer, but it also could be true of Pfizer and several other companies, or it could be more true for other companies than it even is for Pfizer. Right? Pfizer is who got stung, right? We don't know about these other companies. So, and to give some credit where credit is due here, JFJRP, resident potato masher, did half predict this. I was blindsided, right? I thought that it was just sort of the hubris of virologists, a la Jurassic Park, that they could engineer something that wouldn't evolve and mutate in a certain way, and then it just did out in the wilds. But maybe that was part of the plot, right? The spike protein, if Pfizer or whoever else were modifying it, creating an everlasting stream of virus variants, each requiring narrow immunity to just the new spike protein, well, that would explain a lot. And remember at the beginning when it was said to come from the wet market, I recall a major talking point among naysayers of the vaccine that you're trying to make a vaccine against the common cold, something that has never been done before, always deemed impossible, and now you're saying you could do it in 9 months? And that's seemingly absurd until you look at it and that they're not trying to create a vaccination against coronaviruses. They're trying to create a vaccination against the common cold over and over and over again, right? Because they control. And this is something that I sort of had a weird, like, I had a sense, and that's why I called it the COVID program, because I had a feeling that, and also like a little bit of I mean, this was big. I keep showing this. If I show it, I keep showing this because this was such a big thing in my view of the whole situation, and why I call it the COVID program. Because to me, the COVID program began back here. Now, it probably began way further back, right, with the development of mRNA games. But it certainly, at least it goes back to here. And so in my mind, I just sort of had this feeling, right, this sense that like it's a program. It's a whole program. The virus is part of the program, the lab leak is part of the program, the vaccines are part of the program, the lockdowns are part of the program, right? The pathologization of the vaccine hesitant is part of the program. Right? I didn't see it as like, oh, these are separate things going on. I viewed it as the COVID program, singular. And I guess it and that is largely true, although nothing is ever truly singular. So like for years of racking my brain over what the hell was going on because the whole COVID program, it was so weird, right? So you had the base, you had the you had the astroturf anti-vaxxer blitz sort of in late 2018, early 2019. Clearly this was planned, but it I don't I really don't know if it was a system wide op, right? It probably wasn't WEF directed because Israel was getting priority of the jabs, and they've been suffering for it. They've actually been having bad vaccine reactions for it. Right? Bad batches, good batches, whatever. But they clearly weren't. It clearly weren't. They weren't giving the goyim the bad batches and Israel all the good batches. Right? That's not true. Israel has been suffering mightily for this. So this probably isn't a Jewish op. And when I say it's not a Jewish op, I don't mean there weren't Jews involved. I'm saying it's not Jewish in character or in nature, even if it happens to be Jews doing it. They're just incidentally doing it, pushing it. So so someone with deep pockets and a lot of connections had been doing this because it was being set up in late 2018 with the whole anti-vaxxer bad agitprop. And we also know around the same time you had Bill Gates, likely to Pfizer's annoyance, right? He was going on TED Talks. Um, you know, well, first he was making comments not on TED Talks, but making like comments and like interviews talking about just how profitable vaccine investments are. And then he's going on TED Talks talking about how the greatest danger to the future of mankind is a pandemic, right? And he's doing this like right in line with the general like anti-vaxxer bad media blitz. And of course, I forget what it was called. Exercise something. I talk about this more in my video on the COVID program. Um, so and hopefully this event that people have seen with the Pfizer leaks, that this maybe works as a little bit of a bellwether. That's a little bit of crack in trust in the truth towers, um, which keeps people locked into modern religions. And like the universities, most people don't know this, but there wasn't like some official date at which the old cathedral schools of medieval Europe became secular universities. Like Harvard was founded first and foremost to teach clergy in the New World, because a trip back to Oxford was kind of expensive. So that's why Harvard was set up, was to teach clergy in the New World. And Harvard has just been there ever since. And so anyone who wants to say, oh, this is when Harvard was religious and then they became non-religious. Well, they became less theistic, but Harvard has always just sort of been, and and there's no time at which you can say it went from being, a backward den of religious nuttery to being, the truth tower of today, right? So that's a major problem, right, with modern truth towers, is that they're basically the same truth towers of medieval Europe, which were promoting, a kind of a Jewish heresy of Christianity, which is basically wrong, right? I mean, there's no way it's right. So, so it's not like there was some transformation from being places where half of what was taught was literal like woo mysticism, Jesus died for your sins, that kind of stuff. Um, but then the Renaissance, and as theistic instruction declined, you saw humanities and the social sciences grew in proportion to the decline of the theistic side of the cathedral schools slash universities. So, like if you have faith in the designated truth towers at your place and time in history, um, first off, not only are you doing something which up to at this very point was literally always wrong, um, you know the atheist meme that mocks theists by pointing out how every other theistic religion is wrong, but the theist just thinks that the theist thinks that what he happens to believe just happens to be the right one, just happens to be the one that's correct, right? And that's basically what I'm doing, except I'm applying it to non-theistic religions as well, right? And the truth towers that uphold all religion, right, throughout time, And I'm just saying that, like, okay, well, Harvard was teaching Christianity, that's wrong. Okay, now they're teaching social science, and you believe social science based on the authority of things like Harvard, think of like the truth towers, but like you're doing the same thing now that they did back then, and that's and it was wrong. And look, it was either wrong then and it's right now, or it's right now and it was wrong then, but most likely it's always been wrong, right? So basically, at one point, like even if you think, oh, but I think social science is all true, okay, but you can't cite the truth towers because that process, the basic process of the university and the tenure and the PhD program, or basically other people who went through the process, then get to decide who gets to wear the funny hats to be the doges and stuff. Um, you can't cite that if you think that that process ever produced a systemically wrong result, or if that process has produced systemically wrong results in every other time except now, right? That's the basic problem of having faith in like truth towers and institutions. Um, and I know, like, if you're a shit lib, if any shit lib happens to be watching this, there's always going to be that attempt to try to boomerang and try to hit back and say that I'm religious, blah blah blah. Um, Certainly, it would be hubris to think that I am above sort of the genetic religious wiring, and I've said before that personally, I believe that I am more genetically predisposed to religion than most people. Um, and I think that I have overcome that in sort of my own self programming. Have I? Who knows? Don't ask me. I'm the one in question. Don't ask shit libs. They'll always say that I am because they smear. Anyone who disagrees with the truth towers at their place and time, those are the religious people. That's what shit libs will say. And and don't listen to any like quote unquote centrists because they'll say anyone who has any conviction in anything is 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 bamboozled by something that resembles a religion. Like Sank saying that, right wing. He said something that like right wing is the religion, and like talk show radio hosts are like the new priests of the new conservative religion. And you know, and imagine thinking that like Tucker Carlson has the same level of thought control over his flock, which is limited. It's not, it's a limited flock. But imagine placing that on the same level as academic consensus, right? Over that. Imagine saying that Tucker Carlson's opinions has as much sway or more sway, because remember, saying that like conservatives are the religious analogs, right? Imagine thinking that Tucker Carlson has anything like the amount of influence that academic consensus has over shitlibs. It's just absolutely loony how like they try to boomerang this and try to try to play my game, but like they're wrong and it's ridiculous. I mean, I mean it's really like strained for them to say that, and maybe they believe it. Maybe it's not strange. They just haven't thought about it. They haven't really considered that, like, yeah, like these medieval truth towers, right? They've literally always been wrong, or your position is that always been wrong, except for like the past, not even the past 50 years, because you go back to the 70s, they say some things that shitlibs today don't believe. So really, like they're citing of like the authority of the truth towers, because that's what they're doing, right? They're outsourcing, and a lot of them will come out and just blatantly say this, like, I'm not smart enough to think for myself, so I'm going to outsource my thought to the truth towers. The problem is, if you go back to 1950, which is, in the grand scheme of things, is not very long ago. You go back to 1950, two towers are going to be saying things like, yeah, homosexuality is a mental illness, which, I mean, my fans may think is true, okay, but they were saying things radically different than what they're saying now. So, so how can you trust a process which at any point in time, if you believe the outcome of the process at any point in time, then what you're saying is that every other point in time, the process did not produce the right result. Only at this point in time, this version, this iteration, this testament of the truth tower doctrine, right? At this time, at this place, that's when it's true. Okay. I mean, look, if you want to argue the argument and say X, Y, or Z is true and here's evidence, blah, 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 that's fine. But that's really not what shitlibs are doing, and they know this, right? They know that all those arguments are after the fact, ad hoc. The reason they believe things is because Truth Tower says so. And that's another thing, is that people sort of imagine that, shitlibbery has infected the truth towers, has taken over the universities, and like, backward, you got it backward. It doesn't work that way, right? Truth towerism is shitlibbery, right? It's top down. Shitlibbery is not something that sort of existed, at least not very much, out in the wilds, and then went into the universities and took over the universities. Shitlibbery operationally originated in the universities. Um, so okay, so real time religion formation, and so two events that are semi recent. Um, I think are two key examples. And let me read the chat and see if I'm getting some donuts first before I ramble on more. That I have this. Let's look at, see if I've gotten anything. Oh, I got a little dono. Okay, Nathaniel, Jared Diamond can suck it. Yes, he has. Okay, Cool Kid 1234. Pfizer leaks don't tell us anything new. IMO. Other places are already trying to do gain of function research, presumably to preempt future mutations of the virus spike protein. And then he links to an article. Let me look at the Twitter. Not much on Twitter. Maybe, I think the Twitter experiment may not have worked very well. At least I can't tell. I'll post that. I'll post his link as a comment here. Okay. Where were we? My little notes here. So like, for example, Jesus was probably invented by the timeline of it's obviously a very muddled thing. And I don't think I have like a definitive answer on it. I think it was multiple things that happened. I think that Jesus was invented in Palestine, something like 20 to 30 years after his supposed death. You know, to I think that's probably the best example, or the best evidence of Jesus being a big thing. Now, there probably was a guy named Jesus who didn't really amount to much or anything like that. But the origin of Jesus as an important figure obviously came well after his life, if he had a life at all. There's some people saying, oh, here's some correspondence between some Roman administrators or some higher ups with a, and they're talking about some guy named Jesus. Was that the Jesus of the Bible? Who knows? Um, but it's also possible that the Jesus figure was promoted by some Roman elites in Palestine to make the non-Jewish Palestinians more docile toward the Romans or something, and more spiteful towards the Jews, or maybe it was some mixture of both. Either way, Jesusism, Christianity, um, Christianity, of course, is meaningless because Christ is just a title; it's not an actual name. So Jesusism would be like more apt, right? Now, in a sense, it could be bottom up, right? That is, it could have spread that way once seeded, but that feels unlikely given how long it took for Jesusism to spread. Um, Another top, but I think what kind of makes more sense, I, Jesusism and the initial spread of Jesusism is something that I think has like not is not the best case of a top down religion, not because it necessarily wasn't, just because evidence is so thin on at that time. Um, and just what it seems to me, and this is all I can say, is that Jesusism was something that was globbed onto by um, Roman administrators when it was sort of early on. And you would do this because in every province there's always a certain number of these like crazy Christians. So Christianity did spread like organically, but it was never going to take over the Roman Empire through a purely organic spread. That it took like these local administrators to identify as Christians, because when you identify as a Christian, now you have a whole bunch of fanatics on your side, right? Because the religion is a lot smaller, so it's going to be a lot more fanatical. And so maybe you only have, only 5% of the people in a given province are Christian, but you have that, right? That's yours. If you're like the one administrator who identifies as Christian, now you're the Christian guy. Now you get those people as your support, and maybe they'll be useful in some way. I don't know, but um, but I think another semi-recent top-down religion would be, and this is not so much a like we would call a full religion. It's more like a sub narrative, and that's the global warming thing. Now, the global warming narrative may or may not have some actual truth to it, and in fact, it may have been promoted precisely because of it being perceived as true. Now, it's definitely not bottom up, and we know it's not bottom up because the average Joe can't perceive, say, a 1 degree increase in temperature average over a year. Like the average Joe is not going to be able to perceive that, um, supposing that was actually happening. So, moreover, big global warming people tend to support reductions in CO2 emissions from the West, despite that will have no impact on global warming. Um, and of course, the global warming it checks two of the three boxes of being a religion. So the first box it sort of checks is that it's historically unique, or being a religious subnarrative, is that it's historically unique, and two, it elicits a tremendous emotional resistance to being questioned. Now, the third box, so basically there's three boxes that I have for determining if something is what we would call religious in nature. One is that it's historically unique. Two is that it's emotionally held, that you get really angry when questioned. And the third is that it's non-technical in nature. And this is where this is where things get screwy when you get into modern times. And this also ties back into the evolution of organizations. So the problem is that all modern religious narratives present themselves as technical in nature. They all do. And thus the question of whether some proposition is actually a technical one is, it's practically speaking, most of the time inextractable, right? Because everything will present itself as technical nowadays. In the past, it was a lot easier because you could There are still a lot of people who are presenting religion like non-technically through divine revelation or I had a feeling or things, So, but nowadays that the non it, something being non-technical in origin is much harder to drill down to because everything is ultimately defended on technical grounds. So, and recently we've been seeing religion formation extremely fast, or at least narrative formation very fast, much faster than before, and and that are undeniably a result of interest pushing it. So the first would be sort of the increase in anti-white race hate, which I know I should have had that. I should have got that picture of that. It basically corresponds with a rise in the use of, well, I'm sure a lot of people have seen that infographic of like all these media outlets suddenly, like out of the blue, starting to use like racism, white supremacy, white privilege, but all like the whole anti-white suite, starting to use a lot more of that in their articles, and that, of course, sadly changing public opinion. People now believe white privilege is a thing. The one people who you are legally allowed to discriminate against are the ones with the privilege. Um, and it's also kind of amazing that, like, I mean, this wasn't even true in the boomers' day, but like you could have made a more plausible case against boomers and their white privilege, but who is all the white privilege shit being taken out on? It's being taken out on millennials and zoomers. Like, holy crap. I mean, so um but what's it talked about? But yes, so that was obviously something that was a very top down thing, right? Because it never came about, from the bottom up. Obviously there's always going to be a bunch of black people and a bunch of like do-gooders who you know who will occasionally sort of organically say that here and there. Um, and so that's sort of what you see with like religions being top down, is they do exist to some extent without top down support, but it's always at a much lower level, and it doesn't really matter. The majority, for example, the majority of white people were never going to believe in white privilege narratives if it wasn't institutionally pushed. So it has to be institutionally pushed for a religion to ever, or a religion or any new narrative to really be accepted. So and another thing about the whole anti-white movement is that it clearly came about temporally, like right after the Occupy Wall Street movement started getting big. So so it really looks like that was a way to redirect, you know, um, so the more organic opposition to big business, into like anti-white hate. So, and the second thing is sort of the COVID based sub narratives. Now, the COVID based sub narratives, obviously, they're much more of a flash in the pan. Right? They're not going to last for a lot for very long in the way that global warming can, right? Because, well, for reasons that I think are becoming more evident. So now the COVIDians, as they're derisively called, they're definitely a minority, even among shit libs. Um, but there's a set of COVIDians who treat the jab and non-jab measures promoted and sometimes forced. That there's a set of people who support them out of proportion to any real harm. And this is subjective on my part because the stated reason for like hatred of the unvaxxed by the COVIDians, which is less today than it was, like a year ago. Um, the stated reason for that is that it was for empirical reasons, right? That you're increasing the risk of spreading a disease, and that's why we hate you for being unvaxxed. Right? That's the stated technical reason for hating the unvaxxed. Now, there are several things that make this kind of unlikely. There's the stated technical reason for hatred of anti-vaxxers. The first is that shitlibs are, as a rule, less concerned with disease than conservatives, just generally. And as we know, all cognitive traits are to some are to some extent heritable in nature. And since there's no obvious environmental trigger, the heritability of this difference of 50% seems to be likely. So that's the first issue, right? We have a people who, from everything we know up to this COVID thing, are less concerned with cleanliness, less concerned with disease in general, less concerned about racial foreigners, have messier rooms. Okay, these are all like true facts about like left wing quote unquote people. Um, Suddenly they're the ones really concerned about a disease and a virus, right? So that there is just one, sort of meta critique of the idea that that the reason they're so mad at the unvaxxed is for the stated reason of disease, right? And this is coming from people who we know don't really care about disease a whole lot. So a second issue is that claims to be concerned about some generalized harm in general, uh, like in like some utilitarian sense, are usually lies. Because like people aren't utilitarians. Like for example, World War II, Jewish deaths obviously matter a lot more than non-Jewish deaths, right? The supposed 6 million Jewish deaths are felt as more important than the 60 some odd million non-Jewish deaths. And I think that's absolutely true. Um, that's one of these things where, few will actually say that. Like almost some will say that, but almost nobody will actually say that. They care more about the Jewish deaths than the non-Jewish deaths in the war. But based on like the first thing people bring up when talking about the horrors of the Hitler regime is the Holocaust, not the wars and the war death. Right. So you can see it in their behavior as opposed to what they say they care about. When people actually talk about the Hitler regime, Holocaust immediately. Right? Not the wars, not the war deaths, Holocaust, right? And that is a clear non-utilitarian thing. So, in addition, the continent of Africa does tug at people's heartstrings from time to time, like especially like those late night, care about, look at this little African boy who can grow up to be a doctor, give him some food because there's a famine in Ethiopia or whatever. Like in practice, though, people tend to spend more on like local religious causes, like trannies, right? Or in the case of like, or the cause of black in the U.S. or whatever. So even though like all the stated reasons for those domestic religious causes are to reduce harm in some universal sense, it's like, but if you point out that like $1 could feed a starving African child for a year, something like you say that and they know that and they will agree it. Like they're not in denial of it. They're not in denial of the basic math of that being true. But then as soon as you get out of their face and stop haranguing them about it, they'll go back to caring much more about like, supposedly black cars being searched by police like 10% more than white cars, right? And say, or like blacks have to send out, 3 resumes for every 2 for the same odds of getting a certain job or something, right? So they're way out of whack in terms of the priorities and magnitude because they're not utilitarian because people aren't utilitarian, right? So which makes the utilitarian and technical supposed reasons for why the COVIDians hated anti-vax or not anti-vaxxers, but the unvaxxed, at least for this stuff. That makes that so super implausible because everything else we know is that people aren't utilitarians and shitlibs in particular aren't utilitarians either. That's a thing there. Let me read some stuff. If there's any comments. Okay, someone said asked a question. Actually, let me do see if there's any power chats, any white power chats here. White power chats. Okay, $10 from Anonymous. Hey, bud. Smiley face. Well, thank you, Anonymous. Swizzpoo, thank you so much for all you've done over the last 15 years. Oh, God, don't remind me. I love you. Well, I love you too, Swizzpoo. Let's see if there's any more right here. Is anybody watching on Twitch? I have one viewer on Twitch. I have 3 followers on Twitch, and I have some comments on Twitch. Oh, my God. I don't think the Twitch is going to last very long, bros. All right, anything on... Oh, God, the YouTube thing is scrolling all over the place. Oh, God. I just opened the YouTube thing, and the chat is, like, flying because it's all these older things. All right, well, I'll just keep doing... going on my thing. Where was I? But yeah, so, like, if the term... If... like, in terms of causes of death and, like, hardship, it's not that COVIDians did or did not know that other preventable causes of death outweighed COVID. Like, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but, however much you believe the official figures on that and all that, it's that basically they don't bother to check that. And in fact, they actually get a little bit annoyed if you try to downplay the COVID deaths by saying, like, you're more likely to die from a car or something, right? That actually annoys them to so much as bring that up. And now it annoys them when you bring that up, and so they may do some sort of mockery and sort of in beforing without actually saying why that's a bad argument, of why that's a bad sort of, I guess, priority questioning. That's a bad sort of priority questioning argument. So, but the thing is, obviously you can't explicitly come out and say it is like it's a religious thing, right? And it's similar. This is similar to racism, right? Things are bad because they are racist. Like Kim Jong Il. Here's all the bad thing Kim Jong Il does, and here's like anybody who said like a single word against him, and they were worked to death in a camp or something, or some documentary on how bad North Korea is, which probably sensationalized, exaggerated, whatever. But let's say you're like a viewer and you believe that, but you can be rest assured that Kim Jong Il is not a racist. He's not a racist. Right? Mao Zedong, not a racist. Islam is not racist. Or back when Islam was like the big bad. Islam is not racist, right? And so, Joseph Stalin may have been worse in Hitler than Hitler in every like quantitative way, even right, even by like accepting the Holocaust, true Holocaust, and face value, which I do. To make it very clear, I am a Holocaust believer, a 200% Holocaust believer. Okay, I don't believe 6 million Jews were killed. I believe 60 million were killed. Okay, I believe more Jews were killed than there were Jews on the planet. That is how much of a believer I am in that. Okay, but even so, Stalin killed more, right? But he's not bad because it's not racism, right? It's not racism. So, and that's kind of what I see happening here with like the hatred of the unvaxxed, right? That obviously like they hate unvaxxed more than they hate, say, like let's say that like the unvaxxed, you could actually like quantify the deaths caused by the unvaxxed and had like a true number, couldn't be argued with at all. And let's say it was less than the number of deaths caused by drunk driving, right? Shitlibs aren't suddenly going to get in a tizzy about drunk driving, right? Let's say it's 40,000 a year from drunk driving, 20,000 from as a cause of deaths of people who would have lived if not for some unvaccinated asshole. Shitlibs are not going to look at that and go, okay, well, now I am twice as concerned with drunk driving as I am with the unvaxxed, because it's twice as many deaths as the death attributed to the unvaxxed, if you could get a number like that. They wouldn't do that, right? because it's not about utility. That's because that's not how human brains work. Human brains aren't fundamentally rational. They'll rationalize after the fact. That's how just brains work. So no, they don't. And of course, now we're knowing that the unvax are probably actually reduce the spread, but that comes later. That wasn't known at the time. Um, so same thing. I saw this like sort of real time religion formation, really top down, really fast. Religious narrative formation was with the Ukraine situation, right? We saw in real time a kind of religious reverence for Zelensky and plucky little Ukraine against big mean Russia. And I remember in the 2012 presidential debates, right, when Barack Obama debated Mitt Romney, these circuses that they have. Obama mocked Romney's anti-Russian attitudes as being a relic of the Cold War. The Cold War wants its foreign policy back. So clearly, hatred of Russia is not something that shitlibs are set in stone to do. Right? It's not like part of being a progressive is to hate Russia. Right? That was never the case, at least not until very recently. So it's not like a fundamental tenet of being, being part of Team Truth Tower is you have to hate Russia. It had to be crafted, right? And you saw sort of the crafting of like the anti-Russia stuff with tying it to Trump based on, as we know, nothing, right? Based on it was weird how it happened. Apparently there was some dossier that was actually an example that was produced by the CIA as an example of misinformation to say this is what misinformation looks like. Trump went to Moscow and hired hookers to pee on him or to pee on the bed that Obama was in or something. Whatever. It was something stupid and gross, right? And then this thing that was meant to be that was supposedly meant, here's an example of misinformation. This was then sent to news outlets, right? News outlets reported on this leaked dossier. Oh, Trump was doing all this stuff in Moscow. And then, of course, it went from the news outlets. Then John McCain got it and said, what's going on, Trump? Right? So, and then, of course, and then I think the circle was completed. I think eventually either the CIA or the FBI was tasked to investigate it. Right? So it started out as a fake dossier from the CIA, went to like the shitty media, the alphabet, City Times media, then got all breathless about this. Then I went to the Congress, and proud and moral John McCain said, "What is going on, Trump?" And then I think the circle was completed. I'm not certain of but I think the circle was completed. The CIA and FBI ended up investigating the claims of this. I think it was the Steele dossier or something. I forget the name of it, but it was quite kind of funny how it happened. That might be a good video because it's actually kind of a funny thing, even in like a non-political sense. Sort of I don't know what you'd call it. You'd call it something. The something of the Steele dossier. There and back again. The Steele dossier. So, yeah. So, and while the Ukrainian narrative probably has, I mean, it's going to have way more staying power than the COVID narrative. But the thing is, with both of them, we saw how both of them formed in real time and as a result of interest. So these are real concrete actors in the world fighting, forging and shaping religion based on their own interests. And the truth towers, the universities, do what they always do, is to, and I think the truth towers are a little bit interesting because what they basically do is they forge and uphold, they uphold interests. They uphold religious narratives forged by power, but they themselves are also kind of a power base. Right, kind of like the church in medieval Europe, right? Because the church would do things to uphold the power of the king, but then they also have sort of a mind of their own. which then puts them in conflict with the king. So there's this kind of so the relationship between the kings and the church is always complicated because the church is doing two things at once, right? They're pushing their own stories, but they're also sort of upholding stories for the non-church kings or the secular rulers, even though they're not. I mean, they're devoutly papist at this time, but their power base is fundamentally secular, and so I think you still have that same dynamic now. And obviously, the church is in a very powerful, but at the same time precarious situation because the divine because they are the basis for the right of kings to rule, but also the kings have like all of the sort of real world authority right there and at any particular location on the field, so long as people continue to follow them. So how much power does the church really have in any given province in Northern Europe? And so I think that's kind of the same situation here with the universities and like corporate interests. There's sort of a back and forth between them, similar to medieval Europe. Now, is there intersection between power and truth on an issue here or there? Maybe. Well, for global warming, it would depend on how you sort of define the parameters. Like, like for big like planetary destruction scenarios in global warming, they all call for a positive feedback effect from the Earth's climate system in order to get the runaway greenhouse effect. That's because otherwise you're just going to get the direct climate forcing of CO2, methane, whatever, and that's not enough to turn Earth into Venus, right? So, in order to get the real big effects, the real big fearmonger effects, you need a positive feedback system, and so you need a runaway greenhouse effect, which seems unlikely to me since the Earth has remained habitable for hundreds of millions of years. I don't know how long life has been on Earth, but given how long life has been on Earth, and that the Earth has not turned into Venus or Mars, that the Earth's climate system is most likely a negative feedback system. So that's really the issue. Is what are the net feedback effects of the Earth's climate system? Are they positive or negative, or do they or are they mostly negative and then become positive after a certain point, and then you get the runaway greenhouse effect or something like that? But and there are people who will talk about that. There are people who will debate who will debate about the global warming issue the way it should be debated about everywhere, right? But you know, but the fact that that's not how it's talked about, generally speaking, is evidence that the global warming issue is not about global warming, really. Another piece of evidence of that is that the kinds of people who make a big stink about global warming, like basically the Davos Club, WEF people, heads of big corporations, big politicians around the world, that all of these people who are saying that global warming is a big deal aren't acting as if it's a big deal. They aren't acting as if it's actually true. As an aside, that was also kind of the case for like the Holocaust, is that there's lots of things that like the Western powers did that were congruent with the Holocaust being a hoax as opposed to it being real, but that's another story for another time. But basically nowadays we know that like that all the big money people pushing global warming aren't acting as if they really believe it, or that they really believe in the major catastrophic effects of it. So, but some people don't know that the issue of the direct warming effect of CO2 isn't an issue, right? And that's also why, like the consensus stuff, I don't want this thing to be about global warming and dealing with like the ridiculous way in which they identified consensus on that. Basically looking through scientific articles and then they themselves code whether this person is pro global warming or not, or believes in it or not, or and the parameters are all F2 because the direct forcing effect of CO2 on a closed atmosphere is true. It's just, I mean, you could do it in like a little lab, right? And say, oh, look, put CO2 in like a container, and like the container gets a little bit warm, right? It's it's true. Um, like the issue is not that. The issue is the feedback effect from an increase in CO2 or anything else. And so I guess in a way you could say global warming is proven because the direct because CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Okay, like that's true, and you produce more CO2, you may expect temperatures to increase a little bit, unless the increase in temperature causes, say, I don't know, more water to evaporate, creating more clouds, creating cooling, which then offsets it. Maybe not, right? So it's a whole complicated thing, right? And CO2 being a greenhouse gas does not show any of that. And so and one thing, I'm having source amnesia of this, but it was like who was the guy, Michael Mann with the hockey stick, People's Science something something. Anyway, there have been accusations against him that what they were doing was basically if you were a meteorologist and you recognized that CO2 was a greenhouse gas, then you were on board with like the whole global warming narrative, right? Which changes from time to time and is kind of vague as to what it is. Yep, it's kind of a mess, kind of a mess. So so I think it's really only a handful of idiotic true believers with any clout who you'll see occasionally like actually try and usually fail because they have no backing from the rest of the elite to actually do the kinds of things that you would need to do if global warming was a serious problem. Like basically, if global warming is a serious problem, then basically it's like we need to deindustrialize India and Africa like ASAP. Like that's basically like the thing. Um, because if you want to reduce emissions, you have to go into India, also China, and increasingly Africa, and you're gonna have, and so, but they're not doing any of that, right? Because so that's a sign that they're not really taking it seriously, not really interested in taking the sacrifices to do that, which is another piece of evidence that this is like a top-down op, not a genuine thing. That the global warming has become kind of a narrative that's useful in certain ways. So the Ukraine thing, the global warming thing, the COVID thing, these are examples of sort of religious narratives being formed very rapidly. And in the case of global warming, there's a little bit more of a case that it could be technically true, that could be true on technical grounds. But even so, it would just be by almost like happenstance that it ended up being true. Because obviously, the interests that are pushing for global warming are not acting as if it is true. What if it happens to be true? If the danger of the venusification of Earth is true, um, nobody is really acting like it's true. Nobody powerful is really acting like that's true. And clearly, it's being used for other things. It's being used for I think Michael Moore did a movie on the the green energy scam, stuff like that. So the green energy grift. Um, so let's take another thing, like say racial equality and cognitive function, which is another deeply religious belief, right? Um, Again, we can sort of infer that that's a religious belief, and that it's historically specific. It's non-technical in origin. I think that's easier to say that the belief in equality in cognition in humans that is a that belief is non-technical in origination than it is for global warming. Um, because I think, frankly, unfortunately, global warming may actually be technical in origin, even if it was like a mistake that someone made in the 1960s and a bad extrapolation or something. I think global warming truly was technical in origin. and it kind of happened, had to be, because people on the ground could not, are not going to directly perceive temperature increase, day to day, even if there's an average, even if there's like an average 3-degree temperature rise, like the average person is not going to perceive that. So it can't really be grassroots for global warming. But I think for like the racial equality and cognitive function, that you can that I think checks all three boxes. One, it is historically specific, right? Now, all throughout history, people have had all sorts of ideas about like why people are the way they are, bizarre environmental ideas and bizarre hereditary ideas. Um, there's a book on like Roman conceptions of race or whatever that has like very bizarre ideas, both genetic and environmental, on things. Like one idea is that like, oh, living out in the sun, it makes it, you know, that like living in the sun makes you more, you know, feisty or something. And they have a lot of, there's a mixture of really strange environmental and strange hereditary ideas. Like things can be inherited, but not just from the father, but from like some spiritual ancestor or something that can then affect the innate characteristics of the baby. So, but the point I'm saying is throughout the entirety of human history, there has always been a recognition of inherent tendency and environmental effect. However strange it may be from certain places and times, that was always the case. That that it was a push pull between environmental tendency and or genetic tendency. They didn't know what a gene was back then, but sort of innate heritable tendency and environmental effect. So this recent thing of racial equality and cognitive in innate cognitive tendency, and it's particularly narrow. That is historically unique, right? It's not something that was obvious to anyone at any other place in time. So it's historically unique. Um, it's also emotionally held, deeply held, right? Um, Now, it being non-technical in origin, of course, it's defended on technical grounds nowadays. But it being non-technical in origin, I think is quite clear from sort of the time period in which it started to be pushed in the West, which is basically post World War II. And it also corresponded um, with the increase in Jews and Catholics in U.S. universities. So the timing of when it came about is also evidence that it's non-technical in origin. And they also sort of give the game away of it being non-technical in origin when they talk about just how horrible, white supremacist neo-Nazis are. It's laced with more. The thing is, even the initial technical pushes for this idea of, you know, identicalness in cognitive genetic tendencies between the races. Even like at the very beginning, it's laced with moralizing claims and how it's wrong and how it's evil to believe anything otherwise. So the non-technical origin for racial equality and cognitive function, I think, is quite clear. Um, that may be something that I have to make more of a case on than just sort of saying it. But for now, I'm just saying it because it seems obvious to me that it's non-technical in origin, that it's emotional. It's a moral value thing. Right? They find it like a morally just description. As bizarre as that sounds, as contradictory as a morally just description, because the descriptions should just describe the thing. Um, I think that's what they're doing. That their description of they're looking at descriptions as being moral or immoral. So, which is not logically correct, but people, right? Um, so so like like if we consider race realism, like depending on the person, they can become angry when presented with like race denial arguments. Like I sort of will from time to time. And that is a flag of religiosity. That is my sort of emotional reaction. So is Ryan Falk, race realist? Is this religious in nature? Is this thing kind of religious in nature for Ryan? So emotionally held, check. Um, Historically specific, no, definitely not, check. Right? History of thought on this stuff is all over the place. Right? So it's not historically specific to say that there's a mix, right? And that the environmental component and genetic component can vary from place and time, and the thing about 80%, that's like the heritability within certain parameters in the United States at this place and time, right? So no, not historically specific. How about non-technical in nature? Um, for me, definitely not. Definitely not. It is definitely technical in nature, or excuse me, not nature, in origin. Because before any of the technical anything, um, like I didn't really give the matter that much thought, right? Obviously, when I first read the bell curve, I had sort of, okay, so evolution in humans, right? Okay, so I guess there's sort of that initial sort of bias, and that, like, well, I mean, they're probably different in some way in all parts of the body, including the brain. I don't know why the brain would be off limits for that. So I guess, and that in itself is kind of a technical belief, right? It's not something that I was like deeply emotionally wedded to, the idea of evolution in all things. So it didn't really start out as something that I wanted to be true, right? It wasn't something that I wished for. Um, and like early on, it was sort of a side thing. It didn't become important. It didn't become important until like all the white privilege crap started crashing down, right? Until the United States became more so raceland than it was in the early to mid 2000s. So I would say I check one of the boxes, which is, I get hot and bothered about it, and I definitely check that box. Um, so so for me, like my general reaction to race denial arguments before reading any hereditarian stuff was more of a like what, like a kind of primitive, like what I'll call primitive incredulity at such ideas. Like I wasn't like told anything either way on the matter, but the idea of any degree of equality, like it was not only at odds with everything I had learned about evolution, but also kind of felt bizarre day to day, right? Like the idea that particularly race differences in behavior, that are viscerally apparent, not just limited to like, blacks being, perceptibly less intelligent, for example, that these are all down to life circumstances. In its first instance, felt bizarre given the wide diversity of life experiences that people I knew had and how irrelevant those life experiences seemed to be in terms of what they would do in anything else. Like in terms of like, oh well, he can't learn math because his dad beat him. Like what? Like these are these bizarre connections. Is just sort of on a very primitive, intuitive level, just seemed really wrong. Right. So obviously, this was a very primitive form of direct perceptual reasoning, or less of an analysis and more of a holistic. And early on, I was open to the notion of radical environmental effects being a thing in the modern world as a kind of counterintuitive truth, right? After all, the earth being round, that is a counterintuitive truth. That's not something that's obvious if you're just walking around on the planet. It's like, well, looks flat to me, right? So just because something is primitively intuitive doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be true. So, um, but the hardening and confirmation of my, I guess you say, primitive starting point People, people imagine that like, oh, we read the bell curve and that was where he hardened his position or whatever, and like it really wasn't. Honest engines, it really wasn't, right? Um, like you know, but what actually hardened, you know, and I try to avoid it, but you can only avoid it so much. But the kind of closed mindeding, I guess, of myself on this, um, was when I started to read like supposed refutations. Um, and the thing is, like, you know, like I said, don't insult me, okay? Like I'm not gonna read one thing and be like, oh, that's it, cool. This guy, this guy makes a case, and all the facts that he shows, they fit together like a glove, and it's all so neat and tidy, and this explains this, and I create a big web of of connecting and upholding beliefs, right? Anybody can do that, okay? Um, so at least I'm not going to do that very often, and even then, it's just like an operational, right? Like for example, like when I'm talking to Bronsky about the patriciate and all that stuff, like I'm listening to him, and it's like, okay, this is all kind of big if true, and it's all sort of like an operational, but it's not something that's like core. Like this is absolutely true that like that wasps get their way on policy more than Jews do. It's like, okay, well that's a big if true thing. It feels wrong, but maybe it's a counterintuitive truth. I don't know. So, um, but anyway, so my belief for a while was always that religion mainly came from the top down, right? That it came from powerful people who had some grip or another on like the fantasy structure of the state, right? Sort of the belief engine that allows these things that we call states to operate, right? And this power can be money. It can also be like a powerful fanatical following of people, powerful, a whole bunch of people individually useless, but when bound together, they form a mighty faggot, right? Which can then be wielded like an axe, right? Um, here's a little clip. I've been looking for sort of an excuse to play this clip for a while. Let me see if I can't. See if I can find it. Uh, where was it? Oh God, it's all these like long, long. It's just a little clip that I wanted. Uh, Here we go. Here we go. Let's see. Let's play capture good. So we're gonna watch a video, guys. Hold on, maybe. Are we? I don't know if we are. Can you guys hear that? How do the leaks make you feel as a black man? Um, as a black man. I don't know. I can't make a joke about that. Sorry. uh, I'm having trouble. It normally just plays the audio automatically, but here it's just not playing the audio. Why is it not playing the audio? That I have to fix this. Let me see. Let me see if this works. Ah, here we go.
I do want to say one thing about peer review and one brief thing about science. And I met Wolfgang at a couple of conferences earlier this year, and he asked me to come and speak about the philosophy of science.
Great clip.
So I should just like to tell, if I may, one brief story. In the 19th century in England, there was a real debate over the age of the Earth. One group of geologists had studied the rate of sedimentation of the rocks and had concluded that the Earth had to be hundreds of millions of years old. Another group of geologists measured the temperature of the volcanoes and the rate of cooling of the globe and concluded that the Earth could not be more than 5 million years old, because it would have cooled otherwise. So here are two groups of first-class scientists, both of whom are apparently right. Of course, sedimentary rocks show that the Earth is hundreds of millions of years old, and they were right. And of course, the temperature of the Earth and the rate of cooling meant that the Earth could not be more than 5 million years old, and they were right. So how did these two groups of scientists deal with the dilemma? Did they say to themselves, Professor Popper says that if you're falsified, you are wrong and you must change your course? Or did they say, Professor Popper is not yet born, and therefore we're sticking to our story and we're ignoring falsification? The dilemma of science is that all great scientists ignore falsification. It is almost a definition of greatness that you ignore what others say, you stick to your suspicions and beliefs, and you seek to prove what you secretly know in advance to be true. That is actually the nature of science, and it has to be the nature of science because there are too many observations out there. You have to select your observations, you have to select your theory, and then you spend your life trying to prove it, which is why they say that science advances funeral by funeral, because no one ever changes their mind. In the end, as we know, this dilemma about the age of the universe and the globe was sorted out by radioactivity. The center of the world is radioactive, radioactivity releases heat, and so the world is, as we know, over 4 billion years old. But the point all I wanted to make was, climate change scientists are all post-normal because all scientists have always been post-normal. All scientists always grab a hypothesis and seek to prove it. And peer review is merely a group of people within the same club, all of whom share certain pre-assumptions, and therefore peer review can often be very deceptive. We did not smash ClimateGate through peer review, we smashed ClimateGate through people using freedom of information and through breaking into people's websites. So to finish, all scientists are advocates. They are not judges. Scientists do not seek to say this is right and this is wrong based on the evidence before me. Scientists, that's what judges do. What scientists do is they are advocates. They say, I believe this is the case and I will do everything I can to prove it. And anyone who reads a scientific paper and doesn't understand that all scientists are only advocates, and it can take 20 or 30 years before we really know what the truth is after everyone has died, does not understand the process of science.
I thought that was a neat little clip, and that's something that I've sort of thought for a long time, and it was something that I think the way he said it was a lot better. Also, he's like magic science points man, so it makes me feel better, or makes it, maybe it makes some people more likely to listen to that. And that thing that, which actually, like, it should be scandalous, or it should cause people to, if they believe that is true, if they came to believe that, quote unquote scientists are all just advocates, that they would actually be, and really took that to heart, then they would have a lot less faith in things, and things like the whole COVID program. Um, Whether it could get off the ground at all, it certainly would be a lot harder for it to get off the ground. And but that's just one sort of example of this, of the way religion works. So I forgot what I was actually even saying. Okay, so I'm sort of kicking myself for not seeing it, but I think that there's actually kind of an easy way. Like the initial point of all of this was just to say that I think that most religious beliefs are actually top down in nature, that they're not bottom up. And I was kicking myself for not seeing this, but I think the determination for if a particular religious narrative is top down or bottom up, it doesn't require. I think one way to do that, especially for today, it's a lot easier. If a religion advances from the top down, we would expect it to advance first through things like firms, universities, before getting to the average guy on the street. So, given that we exist in real points in time in history, right? You can, when you poll a people, you're not polling some Platonic ideal of that people. You're polling those people at that place in time. Given this, we would expect to see, for example, firms pushing racial oppression, the whole racial oppression arc, through diversity training, movies pushing, oppression arc, analogical narratives, and we would expect this stuff to be happening before you saw the mass change on like surveys of like the general public. Right. So if if a religious idea is actually advancing top down, you expect to see it in the top places first. Right. Very obvious, very simple. So it seems to be a very easy way of figuring out if the religious narrative is actually top down as opposed to being bottom up. Well, who advances it? Where is it most common? Right. And so when people point out that, oh, people in universities, they're way more liberal. I mean, it's not. No, like universities aren't liberal. Liberal is universities. Right? They're getting it backwards. They're getting it completely backwards. Right? They're putting the cart before the horse on that. And the thing about movie studios pushing that, how that's evidence of like sort of religious capture of, say, a movie studio. Like, if the studios would maximize profit by pushing such narratives, then like we can't say that they've been captured by a religion, because their behavior would be indistinguishable from a theoretical profit maximizing firm. But with the movie Star Wars, Disney Star Wars, for example, I think that's a clear example of religious capture of Disney, because they did a whole bunch of things that well, I forget the lady who was pushing for Disney Star Wars, but she was clearly captured, right? Or excuse me, she clearly knew that that what she was deciding to do in the Disney Star Wars series would cost them money. Female lead in an action movie, that's going to cost you. Black co-lead, that's going to cost you more in the United States than I think, Disney people like to admit, but it's certainly going to cost you a lot outside of the United States, right? Where they don't have, we're basically outside of NATO land, where you have people who don't have like these bizarre, you know, pretzeling excuses and veneration of Africans. Having a black anything in a movie is going to, make it less appealing, right? And they actually, and the thing is, they actually another piece of evidence that Disney knew that they were going to lose money by having a black actor in such a prominent role in their movie is that they I don't think they airbrushed him out, but they made him a lot smaller in like the promotional materials in China than in the West. So uh, that's another piece of evidence that they knew that this decision was costing them money, and they were going to mitigate it. Like if you were trying to make money, you'd pick a star that everyone would like, right, and you would promote them, right. But it's a lot harder to do. But it's so that was evidence that they were deliberately losing money on this venture for religious values. Like African is one of their big religious values. African good, white sort of bad is like their religious value. Um, so right, and then of course they were pushing homosexuality at the end. Um, they had the blue haired femme boss commander or whatever at one part. And there's a whole bunch of other modern religious tropes that people have covered. Like the wokeness of Star Wars is been done to death. And Disney, I think by their own evaluation, they lost money for these decisions, undeniably, but they wanted to, right? And I think they were willing to bite that bullet because the religion was worth the cost for them. Um, and and that is quintessentially a top-down advancement of religion. If Disney was just selling to the customer what the customer wanted, well, okay. Like if that was the case, then that would actually be bottom up, and Disney would just be behaving as like the classical naive conception of a corporation says they should, which is that they're just trying to sell to the consumer what the consumer wants. Okay. So yeah, so another clue is sort of education level of whether a religion is top down or bottom up. If something that we've determined, if like let's say there's an idea that we're speculating, or not, maybe a bit more than speculating, but we've determined that this is a religious belief, right? Like gay man butt sex is not only okay, but you're actually like a really, really bad person if you think that it's bad and should be banned, right? It's not just like, you're just like some hipster guys like, whatever, do whatever you want, I don't care, right? But you're like, but no, you have to say that it's like good, and that the people who think it's not good or not acceptable, they're really bad people, right? Like it's more than just being okay with the gay. It's like you have to kind of support it a little bit, right? You kind of have to like be energetically in favor of gay pride parades and stuff, right? Um, so something like that, for example, something that's clearly a religious thing. Um, if it is more expressed amongst the more highly educated, that is a piece of evidence that this is occurring top down, because you have people who've spent more time in the truth towers are more likely to hold to that particular narrative, things that we call liberal, left wing, whatever narratives. If that's the case, then that's another piece of evidence of it being top down. So, so I think we can get a very general idea of the direction by which a religion is advancing by like one, are firms by any dispassionate analysis leaving money on the table by pushing religious narrative? If no, they're actually making more money by incorporating the religious narrative, kind of like back in the olden days when Hollywood would make like theistic films. um, I think the movie The Passion of the Christ, which wasn't I don't think it was a particularly good movie, but it was a Christian movie in a industry where there's a dearth of Christian movies. I think that's an example of how, for example, movie producers are deliberately and knowingly leaving money on the table by not making Christian themed movies. Even today, they can make a lot of money by making Christian themed movies. They're not. That's religious or ideological or whatever you want to call it. So so like we know, of course, like if you take the USSR, the religious side of the USSR is basically as wrong on any specific religious claim as like a broken clock, right? Like their ideas of value, their ideas of the infinite malleability of man, the new socialist man, which is not something Karl Marx ever said, but he didn't use the term new socialist man, but he basically said that kind of referred to like an infinite environmentality, um, which sort of underpinned like, well, whatever. I mean, basically, like all of the religious claims in the USSR were going to be as wrong as a broken clock. You can find specific things in it that are going to be correct. You could do the same for papism or any Christian subset. You can find things in the Nicene Bible and say, oh, this was actually an accurate description of what was happening at that place in time, right? Like not everything in a religion is going to be wrong, right? You can open up, yeah. So, um, and also, and that occurs both in terms of like the sacred texts, like if you read Capital, like not everything in Das Kapital is going to be wrong. Now the whole thing is going to be wrong, but it's not any specific claim is going to be wrong. Same with when you open up the Bible. Same with the not just the sacred text, but the religion as phenomena. Right, the phenomena of papism is not going to be incorrect in terms of every policy that they propose. Like they could say, I don't know, um, no sex outside of marriage, and that should be legally enforced, and that may be a good thing, right? So, so it's like not everything that they do is going to be wrong. Um, upholding the feudal order, of course, is wrong. But not everything that they do is going to be wrong. So, like if you're a shitlib and you're doing like a kind of narrative preservation dance, like what they'll actually do is they'll go, well, the top-down advancement of religion, that's actually evidence of it being an advancement of truth. Because either firms, universities, or like news outlets, or some combination, these things are held in some esteem to the shitlib, right? But but then again, 1950, right? So that counter to this idea that that if religion is being advanced from the top down simply as sort of the dance of the interests, the dance of the lobbyists, lobbying Congress, but also lobbying universities, like the dance of interests. That it's not that the advancement of like, oh, we're now understanding just the depth and the magnitude of white privilege. That's actually the advancement of truth qua truth, not some alignment of interests. To say that and to believe that is to hold one or more of these institutions in a certain amount of esteem. Typically, it'll be the truth towers. Typically, it'll be the universities that they hold in esteem. So in order to take the top-down advancement of clearly religious beliefs, like deeply held, historically specific, and not so much technical, but kind of moralistic in origin, that to think that these are really just the advancement of truth and not the advancement of power, you have to hold the universities in esteem. You have to hold them up, right? But of course that's contradictory because, these people, they wouldn't hold them up in like the 1930s, right? And wouldn't go, oh, well, that process, because the university is fundamentally just a process, right? So when you say I believe in the universities, you're saying I have belief in a process, because the thing is, you take because clearly they don't have faith in like just the proclamations of some 18-year-old showing up at a university, who even if they know that 18-year-old would eventually become a PhD in physics or something, that's a bad example. PhD in economics or some other humanities thing, they're not going to have faith in that 18-year-old before he gets that degree, even if they know he's ultimately going to get that degree, they don't have faith in him before he has gone through the process, right? And so faith in the universities, or sort of this kind of outsourcing of thought, I'm going to trust the experts, is faith in the process of expert production, right? So really, when you say, well, I have faith in expert consensus, you don't really have faith in those people. Really, you don't really have faith in those people. You have faith in the process. The problem is the process is basically unchanged from what it was in 1950, and the process has been producing radically different results. You can needle and cherry pick and say, oh, the cathedral schools in 1400, they differed in how they taught the classes this way, and they, and tenure worked a little bit differently, and you can needle and nickel and dime and come up with some ways in which the process was a little bit different, and you will. The world is big enough that you can always find differences between things that are mostly the same in order to discount an analogy, right? You can always do that. There will always be enough little bumps in the road that you can say it's not the same road. What was I saying? Yeah, that was basically my. I forgot what I was saying, but yeah, but if it's coming from the top down, it's coming through a process, and you can't really trust the process, because even if everything today is 100% super duper pooper true, it's not true. In this same process did not produce the same results even in the United States in the past. The same, similar things in the Soviet Union, like basically, like, even shitlibs who have like sort of an emotional soft spot for the Soviet Union, although that's less and less the case as time goes on, as basically the 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 socially unenlightened nature of the Soviet Union. I mean, it wasn't, but relative to today, the socially unenlightened nature of the Soviet Union is making them sort of retrospectively be panned by shitlibs. But certainly, like, that like it was mostly wrong. But the university process in Russia, it's not fundamentally different from the West. It's just not. And I know that you can say, oh, but they pay professors differently here, or professors don't have as much protection here, or that, or whatever. And you can always do it. You can always make a little bit of a case, but you know what you're doing when you're doing that. You're trying to deny something that is basically true and basically timeless. Um, and one could probably argue against you on those points and say, no, there's more academic freedom in Russia than in the U.S. or whatever. But it's all just it's all just kind of a game. Uh, so just so before, like, getting into like the nitty gritty on any given issue, or like looking at the studies, just by inference and patterns of prior religions and truth towers, we can reduce the workload for evaluating what's real. This is not going to be particularly persuasive, I don't think, but in terms of you quickly figuring out what's real, or at least this is just what I do. Just look at a few things, whether or not a thing is true or not. So, is something religious in nature? Is the religious narrative top down in nature? I think if it's top down, it's less likely to be true than if it's bottom. Not always, it could be a top down religious narrative because really well connected big brains discovered something, right? So it could be top down. But I think that if something is top down in nature, it's less likely to be true, and more a function of interests, the dance of the interests at the top. So, um, so to figure out if something, like, is does something seem religious in nature? Like, again, is it historically specific? Is it non-technical in origin? And by non-technical, I mean, is it Does it seem moralistic and emotional origin? Is it coming from a place of emotional desire for this thing to be true? Right. Um, so even if it is later going to be technically defended, because everything is technically defended nowadays. So historical specificity, non-technical in origin slash moralistic in origin, and deeply emotionally held. They get really pissed when questioned, right? So those are really, I think, the three red flags. Um, and if a narrative checks those boxes, it's probably religious in origin, or more appropriately, these are the essential characteristics of religious narratives, and so it's it's a lot less likely to be true. Um, and it could be true just by happenstance, right? So yeah, that's sort of what I want to talk about. Um, so for the Russia-Ukraine war, I think anti-Russian sentiment in the U.S. it's clearly elite driven, um, and of course the real causes of the war, such as the Ukraine refusing to honor the plebiscite in Luhansk, which they agreed to previously. They're all kind of crowded out by that. Basic knowledge about the origins of the war just aren't known, or at least they're kind of blared out by this propaganda drumbeat about Russia's evil and Russia's losing. I don't know how long Russia's been on the brink of complete collapse. I think for the past year they've been like a month away from completely collapsing. So more examples of top-down religions would be things that like tag themselves as communism. Um, like Maoism was definitely, undeniably, like top-down, because Mao was like a little rump state. Did not have majority Chinese support. Most of the Chinese supported Chiang Kai-shek, and you know, Maoist China, after the defeat of Japan, the Soviet Union took over Manchuria. What Stalin did was then give Manchuria to Mao, and now Mao had a significant industrial base. I think I read something that Japanese Manchuria had like more like war production than the rest of China at the time. And so Mao was now had something close to the similar war production of Chiang Kai-shek, and of course Mao was being funneled more material than Chiang Kai-shek got from the West. So that was clearly an example. That's classical top down. Like I don't know how much more top down you can get than literally being propped up by foreign governments and through military conquest defeating the more popular natural leader of China, who was Chiang Kai-shek. To the extent Chiang Kai-shek was natural, maybe Chiang Kai-shek was also top down in certain ways, but Mao was certainly a top down. Just looking at Mao, he was certainly top down and kind of imposed upon China by the Soviet Union. Believe it or not, like basically Chinese communism was imposed by the Soviet Union. It's a weird way to think about it. Uh, Same with the Bolsheviks taking over in Russia. Um, like I think the Bolsheviks, I think Lenin tried to have like an election, and like the Bolsheviks like did crappy, and then there were no more elections. Um so and we know that the Bolsheviks took over basically by it's sad to say this, but by out organizing and just militarily defeating their opponents. Um so that's another clear example of top down. Now, it's not like they didn't have any support. They may have had something like 20% of Russian support. So it wasn't like zero support at all for something communistic in general, or at least, you know, anarchistic or labor something. Though I doubt many of them were like true dyed in the wool fans of Marx and labor theory of value and stuff like that. So certainly in the Soviet Union, certainly in China, we know that these things vaguely called communism were imposed from the top down. Uh, so like segregation in the presence of Africans. That was always sort of an immediate instinctive policy among all Eurasians, like including like Arabs. So South Africa and Southeast US, they would have segregation, and the white public didn't start moving against segregation until after World War II, and all of like the moralizing campaigns to end segregation because segregation's bad, segregation's immoral. So that's like to say that that was about like it's really weird to say that like an anti-segregation movement in the Southeast US or even or in South Africa that these were like organic movements among the whites in those places. Um, it's really weird to say that because they both started to happen sort of because of the timing of when it happened, right? Um, this is not a quantifiable fact, but I think it's one of a would be like a generally accepted factoid that after World War II, anti-segregation propaganda became bigger. I'm being kind of vague about that because I don't know how you could possibly quantify that. Um, but like it clearly like the thing is like to have a bottom up movement like come all at once to go against a sort of primitive universal, right? Because that is a primitive universal. Staying like keeping blacks out of your domain, that is a primitive universal. All people do it if they're not told otherwise. Like if there's ever a large number of blacks in an area, you keep them out, right? That's just what people do, right? Right, wrong, good, bad, it just is. So, and because it's a primitive universal, it's super duper pooper. It seems super duper pooper unlikely that any movement to stop that, to stop doing something that is because that's in a class of primitive universal, to get them to stop doing that, that would be that would be bottom up. That people are that there'd be like some guy, some charismatic figure who's just owns a hardware shop, going, you know what? I think that I think this place would be a lot better, and everyone and it'd be the right thing to do if like blacks were allowed in here. In fact, allowed everywhere in our public libraries to live right next door and all the and like you know like and the thing is to have like a population that is pro segregation from literally like and the thing is segregation like existed contemporaneously with chattel slavery. So segregation is older than slavery, but it at least goes back to 1865. You know, in terms of like popular low-level segregation. Then you start to get segregation that is more codified in law, but like informal segregation, it certainly goes back to 1865. And to say that those people, like for 100 years, or I guess the rabble rousing didn't start until like hot and heavy, at least until like 1954. But then you're like, what? Like 90, 89 years of people and like in all this time, you'll get a few moralizers and do-gooders and busybodies like everywhere here and there. But in all that time, there was never a real effective grassroots movement to end segregation in the Southeast US. Right. But then suddenly in 1954, and from then onward, now suddenly like they're being awakened somehow. That just seems odd. Like grassroots movements need to be like they can't just come out of nowhere, right? They have to be in response to some particular event, right? And part of the event could be like a collapse in living standards, like for example, you know, like peasant revolts tend to come about, which are clearly bottom up, tend to come about as a result of famine or something that shuts up some economic shock, tend to produce peasant revolts, right? So bottom up events don't just come out of nowhere, right? So you're not going to have like a bottom up event. You're not going to have bottom up opposition to segregation in the Old South, when like when everyone's standard of living in that area is just going up, right? Including the blacks who are supposedly suffering from segregation. So it's clearly a primitive universal, right? So so whenever you have, so that would be another piece of evidence that something is not only religious but probably top down in nature, not necessarily, because you can get things like Scientology that will get people to go against sort of their instincts, primitive universals, give up their children, stuff like that. So it's not always, but when you have somebody who believes something that is clearly at odds with a well-established primitive universal, like keep out foreigners, keep out especially foreigners who not only dress and talk differently but look differently, right? That is a primitive universal. And when you have people saying, not just like in a passive way to say, well, this guy maybe not so bad, whatever, but they're saying like, no, it is wrong to keep out racial foreigners, that it is like evil and terrible for so, and what they're doing there is they're castigating a universal instinct as being inherently evil. Okay. And when someone's doing that, that's clearly, that should be taken as like religion. That's clearly, something going on. And the kind of innate wiring that people have, to become religious. Obviously we know that, and this is what's kind of messy about this, is that religion itself is a universal, right? But it's not a primitive universal, right? It's not like, it's not like one primitive universal would be like, keep gross things out of the village. Like, oh, that's gross, keep it out, right? That would be that would be a primitive universal. Religion is not primitive because it has to be instantiated somehow. You have to convince people of it. So, all right. What was I doing? Okay, so one thing I've thought of, I don't know how practical this would be to implement at all, but I think one way to get an idea of how accurate religious beliefs are, or at least a kind of upper bound estimate, is to take some hard scientific question, which, which at one point the answer to the question wasn't no. Right? Like, I don't know, plate tectonics or something, right? And try to ascertain what percentage of research that the relevant hard scientists believe things that ended up being correct or incorrect, 30, 40 years later, right? Because that's kind of what a religious proclamation is doing. Like, let's say you believe something like all races are genetically identical in the brain. Like, that's something that, now, frankly, unfortunately, I think that the evidence is kind of in on that. But it's something that the people saying that, they don't believe the evidence is in. They don't think it's like completely slam dunk proven, whatever. So, but like the nature, like, so anyway, that's just what I want to say. I think that that if you take a hard scientific question where the answer was not known but then later known, and then you try to figure out to some degree of accuracy what percentage of those scientists were correct, and how correct. You can do like, this scientist was, gets 9 points, this scientist gets 2 points, this scientist gets 5 points, in terms of, on like a 10-point scale of their correctness. And then you could do sort of a weighted average on who is more correct or whatever. That would be a way to, I think, give an upper bound estimate for how correct a lot of these softer religious claims are going to be. Like, and I was thinking about this because, like the whole failure of the COVID vaccine, for example, that is a clear example of like the process failing, right? It's so that's but the thing about the vaccine, though, is that it was something which was so like it's too direct to be covered up, right? Like if the vaccine was given out and somehow for whatever reason, um, nobody could ever know what the effects of the vaccine were. Like I don't know how that would even work, but let's say nobody could ever know what the effects of the vaccine were. So nobody can know what the effects of the vaccine are. Are people going to believe that the vaccine was safe and effective or that it was a load of crap? I think they would continue to believe it was safe and effective. I think that the failure of the vaccine and the increasing recognition of the failure of the vaccine is a result of just an undeniable physical reality that's happening. And so what I was thinking is that, like this is sort of an argument, is that for most things, even in hard sciences, let alone when you get into like the fields that have filled the shoes that theology once wore, even in the hard science, most things are not as like in your face as the effects of the vaccine, right? And most things in the hard science could be like a vaccine whose effects we're never told about and nobody ever really knows. And if you try to go see the effects, what you're going to get is you're going to get a whole bunch of back and forth argumentation, more in the direction of it working, and like, and every topic is going to be like that. It's just that some topics get, on some topics, the rubber hits the road more than others. And for these vaccines and the belief in these vaccines and the whole mRNA thing that they're doing with it, that was a topic where the rubber really, really, really hit the road, right? Millions of people taking it, like something like billions or something, like crazy sample sizes, out of this world sample sizes in terms of what's normal for any kind of medical research. So the rubber really hit the road on this. So I think I think there's certain disciplines where the rubber hits the road more than others. Medicine in general, obviously, the rubber hits the road a lot more for medicine than it does for, history, where history is where the rubber literally never hits the road. And also that's another thing people don't know. You know what? I've been talking and I just thought of that. That is like a really good point. History is a field where the rubber literally never hits the road. Almost never. Like you could look at the archaeology digs and things like that, but it's pretty rare. It's gonna be like a million times less than say even like economics. The rubber hits the road a lot more. The problem is economies are so complicated that there's an endless outs and stuff. But history is where rubber hits the road the least, and it's also like history professors are the most quote unquote liberal. They're most likely to identify as liberal, and that's something that a lot of people don't know, right? They don't know just how like history is like the worst field. It really is the worst field. I mean, it's what I have a BA in. It's the worst. I hate it. Not that I hate. And the thing is like, oh, so you hate history? Like when people say history, it's like events. Are you talking about events? Are you talking about things that happened? Do I hate things that happened? Like as a class? Oh, things happened. I hate that. Like think about the hubris of like the field of history. Oh, if you want to talk about things that happened, you must go through this process and be processed to become a proper historian. What's a historian? Somebody who knows about things that happened. It's just like what a fucking scam that is. Like I think that if it hadn't been around, if the field history hadn't been around for so long, just the very idea of that, if someone came along and say, "Oh, let's start a new field in these universities. We're going to start a new field. And the field is going to be, what do we do? Well, we basically just sort of describe things that happened. We kind of write down things that happened, and we tell you what things happened, and we are the experts on things that have happened. It's like, well, for things that have happened, maybe like if you want to know about like what happened at like I don't know, like if you want to know about like some war event, like maybe you'd want to get like engineers involved, right? Who would have some better idea of how like I don't know aircraft would work, and maybe you want to get a bunch of psychologists involved to look at all. It'd be like a mixture. It'd be like a mixture of people with various perceived real or imagined expertises on a matter. So you get like a whole bunch of different people who know a whole bunch of things to go like investigate a site, maybe do interviews, look over records, find film or whatever. And it'd be a whole bunch of people who know a whole bunch of different things. Right. And imagine having like a field just for that. Like it's basically like I mean you don't have that going forward. Like you don't have you don't have you know futurians who say, okay, so so historians are people who can tell you all about things that have happened. Futorians, futorians, we will tell you about things that are happening now and will happen. Right? That would also be stupid. Going forward, we have, the idea is you have physicists, engineers, all the types of engineers, chemists, and all the things, right? For going forward, right? But you don't have that but like why going backward? Why do you have like a specific class of analysis for things backward just because it's in the past? Right? Shouldn't you just have the same kinds of people looking at it that you do for the present and forward? Why this separation between from past versus present and future? It's completely arbitrary. It wouldn't fly if the field of history were proposed today. It's not a real field. It's a label. There is no historical method. That's a lie. This idea that there's some historical method that that like people don't just like believe a thing and then because the world is so complicated, they can just tissue together whatever they want. It should be abolished. The field of history should be abolished. It's an evil field. It's yeah. Anyway, sorry that was a little off topic rant. What do I have displayed here? Let me read some chats. I should read some chats. So okay, Corlick for $6, solid stream. Really? Really? Just me rambling about the bumpy roads and history is a scam. That's so, well. Thank you very much, Corlick. Okay. Anonymous for $5. I heard Noam Chomsky argue in an interview that you cannot prove with 100% certainty that if you let go of a mug, it'll fall to the ground 100% of the time. I mean, he's true, but who cares? And then he says, this is CPU brain. Yeah, it is. It is, but I don't think that's an example of I don't think that's an example of CPU interference, of CPU mucking about your behavior too much. Because I don't think anybody actually does that. We'll hold a mug and be like, well, I can't prove with certainty that if I let this go, it'll fall to the ground, so I'll just let it go. And we don't have some pandemic of people dropping mugs because and be surprised that it fell. I don't think that's actually happening. But I think I get your point, is that is that on things that are less clear than that, that's basically the point. And of course, what I divide between the CPU and the ASIC and the human brain, which is sort of a conceptual thing. You can also call it higher order and more primitive order, whatever you want to. It's just words. It's just helpful descriptive terms. like I think what Anonymous is getting at is that the more that the less obvious something is, that you can get counterintuitive truths. But basically, like there are counterintuitive. Here's a counterintuitive truth: Earth is round. That's a counterintuitive truth. That's something that your ASIC is never gonna know. It's something that your ASIC is if you're walking around, you're just gonna be like, round. What are you talking about? Looks flat to me. Um, but basically, the same way in which counterintuitive truths get advanced is also the way in which counterintuitive falsehoods get advanced. You know what? That's I think that's a good a good simple way to express it. Is that the same way in which counterintuitive truths get advanced, counterintuitive falsehoods pose as counterintuitive truths. I like that. I like that. That's a pithy way to put it. I think I'll do a Twitter. Get my little setup open here, and maybe I'll even look at the chat or something. I think a guy's saying solid stream, and maybe he's been watching too many like cozy streams or something to think this is like what passes for a solid stream. How would I say that? Counterintuitive falsehoods pose as counterintuitive truth. It'd be something else. It'd be like big lies. Okay, how about this? Big nasty lies are usually counterintuitive falsehoods posing as counterintuitive truths. There you go. I think that's yeah. Big nasty lies. Big nasty lies are usually counterintuitive falsehoods posing as counterintuitive truths, which then mock those skeptical as being too dumb to get it. There we go. Send out. Excellent. I think it's excellent. Maybe it's terrible. So let's say you take something like biological race differences, and we can tell quite quickly, like the denial of divergent evolution, that's sort of the religious vector, since it's more commonly held the further up into the truth towers you go, right? So we need to be careful on this because we don't want to be blind to counterintuitive truths, right? But the denial of divergent evolution, right? It's also prima facie ridiculous. Like the one part of the body that humans care about, despite being clearly subject to evolutionary forces that affected, that caused like what we call continental differences or other euphemisms for race. They cause race differences in total size. Like we now have studies looking at like total neuron count, total brain size, relative lobe sizes. Like that is not just the total size of the brain, but like, for blacks, like this part of the brain is also relatively larger in proportion to the other sections of the brain, right? So whether this was not subject to any evolutionary force that impacted its function, right? Even though the brain is just part of the nervous system, it's just something that we conceptually divide the brain between the rest of the nervous system. Like physiologically speaking, your brain is actually like in your hand, right? There's part of your brain in your hand, right? Your brain is distributed throughout your body, right? It's not just one right? It's not just the brain, and then there's like the nervous system. It's all neurons, right? It's the same. It's the same. It's made of the same stuff, right? So that your spinal cord, your central nervous system, and the brain are different. It's like, yeah. But so like, and that's another thing that's kind of weird. Is like, so while any two individuals may differ in genetic cognitive tendencies, right? Like one person may be naturally better at math, or more prone to anger, or he may be like a better he may be a good social metaphysician, right? Like he may be good at like ingratiating himself to people or manipulating people, like good social metaphysician, etc. And I think most people, like, sort of at their primitive intuitive understanding, is that that's the case. There are some people who are just innately better at those things, and it's not a result of any life experience. It's not a result of trauma. It's not a result, right? That there's just people, they're just better at it, just because they kind of are, right? And now at the primitive level, you don't know what a gene is. um so you're not going to ascribe things to genetics. It's actually, I think, maybe easier to describe it as being like innateness, right, as opposed to genetics, right? Because people don't, because genes are something very foreign to human, like, evolutionary conception. Like humans didn't evolve knowing what a gene is. Um and of course, like, any two groups of humans can also like systemically differ on like these traits, right? And even the most naive person knows that, like, at least in the case of Down syndrome, let's take Down syndrome, also with like sex differences, but at least with Down syndrome, it's very clear that there is a superficial appearance in somebody that reflects genetic cognitive tendencies in the Down syndrome person, right? So it's very clear in that case. Um, it's also clear, like with women, like females behave very differently from males, very differently from males, and their bodies look very different from males. Okay, now, I mean, I think this is more recently, and this is actually itself another kind of conditioned thing, is that you have guys thinking that like behavior differences between men and women are all socialized, which is like not something people believed in the 90s at all. Um, so it's not like a naturally obvious belief, but it's something that most people in the world today still believe. And it's something that I suspect, like, I suspect, even like, if you take like a 12 or 13-year old who hasn't been told the truth that nothing's genetic, um, they'll like they'll recognize that, at least in the case of, like, for example, people with Down syndrome and women, that physical differences correspond to mental differences, at least at the phenomenal, at least at the final expressed levels. With Down syndrome, it's very easy to say that's a genetic thing because chromosomes. But like with women, it's also chromosomes, right? Like, it's also, men have the Y, which inactivates analogical portions on the X chromosome. Women have two X's. So that difference is also chromosomal. So I was thinking, like, oh, the Down syndrome thing, that's clearly a genetic thing, whereas the male female differences, that's just allele frequency differences. But it's not allele frequency differences. Race differences are allele frequency differences across the entirety of the genome. Sex differences are actually like a little bit more typological, even if they're lower in total magnitude of like SNP variance. Something, I forget the term, but it's less, right, than the race differences in terms of counting SNPs. Uh, but the things people can understand, can get that right, and understand that, at least in the case of Down syndrome and sex differences, external appearance does correspond to internal genetic tendencies for cognition, for cognitive traits, to some degree. I think even like the most hardened like gender denier. Like they don't deny gender differences to a total degree. Like I don't think they deny it completely. They'll deny that like women are worse at math. Like they won't, like they'll deny that. But like I don't know. It's hard to describe. Like when you're just like around women, it's so many little things. It's so many little things in differences in their behavior that just trying to ascribe it all to like environment just feels absurd, right? Just uh, I'm struggling to even like I guess I just set up the task for myself. Describe all the ways in which women behave differently. Right? It's like I mean, like in terms of like it's microscopic, the level, the detail of gender differences. Like not microscopic in magnitude, but microscopic to the all encompassing extent of gender differences in behavior and just how different females behave, just differences in how they walk and when they will say things, when they decide to hold their tongue, when I mean, and describing it, I mean, you can't possibly describe it all. But anyway, so I think so I think sort of at the like primitive, like instinctive level, most people get that there are genetic behavioral tendency differences between men and women. I think sort of among the masses, sort of the denial of gender differences has more to do with like they're not, the has more to do with things like math. Like women, like the belief that women aren't as good as at math, like that's what I think sort of feminism among the plebs actually is. Now, obviously, once you get higher, you get into much crazier scopes of denial, right? You get into things like, you know, gender identity in toto is entirely, environmental in origin, right? But I think among sort of the masses, among the plebs, feminism just means women can do math too. I think that's basically all it means, which that's also kind of false, kind of. But the falsehood is less extensive. Um, but I think as soon, so that's how sort of the average, I think, sort of how I conceive the average Joe as being. He recognized that external appearance does genuinely reflect, you know, cognitive genetic tendencies, at least in the case of like systemic differences between people with Down syndrome and with women. Obviously, those are very different and different magnitudes, but I think the average Joe sees that. But then, and this is what's so crazy, as soon as the groups being compared happen to correspond with like, the classical race categories, and then and only then must the averages in genetic cognitive tendencies, you know, irrespective of variation in total brain size. Now, the average Joe doesn't know about race differences in brain size. He doesn't. But what I'm saying is that like shit libs, or like not just shit libs, but like average Joes that I talk to, um, like even when you present like race differences in not just brain total size but relative lobe size, which should at least call into question the idea of sameness, right? You know, you could say, well, blacks, they have smaller brains, but they're more compact, so they're going to be better. You know, bigger brain does not always higher of whatever it is we're calling intelligence, right? That's not always the case, right? And you can point to, well, elephants have big brains, and whales have big brains, and dolphins have big brains, and and humans are smarter than them. So we, as humans, as a human conception of intelligence, we perceive that to be. But on the other hand, but even within animals, though, dolphins, whales, and elephants, they're pretty smart as far as animals go. So I think there is a relation between total brain volume and what it is we perceive of as intelligence, even if it's not one to one. um Elephants are pretty smart as far as animals go. um so but 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 that's just what's so weird is that most people will recognize that there are some clear, you know, genetic group average differences which can be identified on the basis of sort of superficial appearance. And what most people will also recognize is that two randomly selected arbitrary groups of people can systemically differ in like their genetic cognitive tendency, right? You know, people from one side of the tracks could just be inherently smarter than people from the other part of the tracks, and that's not something, because that's not a really like politically or religiously loaded thing. You know, it's not like it's not something that people have been told, you know, for a long time that that's bad. That's bad to believe that. It's bad to believe like two randomly selected groups of people could differ in genetic cognitive tendency. Because they haven't been told that that's wrong to believe, they just sort of default back to like their you know, just their brains working properly. You know, they default back to, yeah, they default back to using their properly working brain and say, yeah, that can clearly, you know, be true. And in many instances it probably is true that some people over here are more genetically, you know, have more genetic tendency to more of what it is intelligence, or maybe not just intelligence overall or any cognitive, right? But as soon as it's the race category, then it's like all bets are off. Then all previous, you know, sensible reasoning that a person may have done, is more likely to have done. Suddenly that's like, I mean, suddenly it's just ice. It's just like a crystalline obsidian resistance. Like, no, they must be the same. This like, and you're an immoral person for saying they're not. And the resistance is like, you know, it's done technically. It's technical resistance. It's debunking, right? It's saying IQ doesn't. Let's talk about multiple intelligence. William Gardner's multiple intelligences, and like none of it's validated, none of it's predictive of anything, right? But they just like lob onto it just because it's not IQ. And so, so, and look, like when I say this, and I've said this before, I've talked to shitlibs about this before, you know, describing their position in this way. And always what they'll do is they'll uncritically shriek. They'll do a quasi lie, and I say quasi lie because they may partially believe it. But what they'll say is that's a straw man, Ryan. That's not what I think. I don't think evolution stopped at the neck. And then they'll go, well, maybe I just think that race differences are a lot smaller or something, right? They'll say, well, I don't think they're you know, going to be identical. I don't believe that these continental populations are going to be identical in genetic cognitive tendencies. I just think they're going to be like a lot smaller. And the thing is, though, it's like, but when they do that, it's like, what's small? Like what do they mean small? Like, you know, in evolutionary terms, all the differences between blacks and whites are probably really, really small. Black people can read, they can read maps, they can think semi abstractly. You know, a good chunk of them, you know, less than half, but something like 40% of them can understand a conditional hypothetical. Like, you know, like how would you feel if you didn't eat breakfast? You know, that's a conditional hypothetical. Or where would you be now if you didn't buy Bitcoin or something? Like, that's a conditional hypothetical. And you know, a little under half of blacks can understand a conditional hypothetical, right? So, um, and like no animal can. Like if if you just sort of gave an animal the ability to understand speech, like you gave a chimpanzee the ability to understand speech, there is no way a chimpanzee would understand a conditional hypothetical. Um, like that. I mean, that's like you that involves like a sense of self, a sense of time, a sense of right. It's a very cognitively complex thing to do, a conditional hypothetical, um, and and something like I think like the rough cutoff line for that was like 90. Like 90 IQ is roughly when you most people with an IQ of 90 or above can understand conditional hypotheticals, and 90 and below is when they start to not be able to understand it. That's for the US IQ. Obviously, like in say um, Iran or something, more of them are going to be able to understand conditional hypotheticals than their IQ numbers would basically places where there's like environmental suppression uh, of IQ scores is where you're going to get people who can do more cognitively complex tasks than their IQ score would predict, right? So it's not that like most of the world can't think in conditional hypotheticals. It's more like the kind of person who would have an IQ if we were born and raised in the United States or Western Europe, that person is going to understand conditional hypotheticals. But just because someone is like 82, but they're born and raised in Iraq, obviously, if you have an IQ of 82 and you're born and raised in Iraq, you're going to be smarter than somebody with an IQ of 82, born and raised in the United States, right? It's obviously, there's environmental suppression going on there. And most of the the validity of IQ is done using basically the NATO world, the Atlantic civilization, and the validity of like what someone can do based on IQ level is really geared towards that population. Once you get outside of that, um, you know, like for example, like the median IQ of sub-Saharan Africa is something like, it varies. Like Witcherts is trying to say it's really high by throwing out a lot of things, but it's like 72 or something. Now they're not that dumb. They're not right. They're not like what somebody with an IQ of 72 would be if they were in the United States. So, but anyway, what was I even going on about? What was I saying? Oh, but yeah. So what a shitlib will do is they'll reject, or they'll say that this is a straw man. They'll say that um, that they're being in basic and very specific denial of, like the specificity of the denial is what is so crazy. And when it's laid out that way, it seems really crazy. And like the shitlib will deny that that's what they're doing, or deny that it's their position. Now, if it is really not their position, then it's only because they haven't really thought this through, right? Um, or then if they go off to say that, oh, it's not, I don't believe in identicalness between like the races. I just believe the differences are really small, and they're a lot smaller than what you're saying. But the thing is, whenever they do that, it's always like, okay, well, what am I saying? Like, and what is small? Like it's just it's all these are all sort of question begging sort of things, what they're doing. Like, as soon as you say it's not identical, that the races aren't all exactly the same in the brain on average, individuals can vary, but the averages must, this is like some sort of iron law, they must be the same. Well, okay, but then like you've gotten away from that iron law, because the moment it's presented, you recognize it as retarded. But then what's the now basically we're both hereditarians, and it's just a matter of degree, right? That's basically where we're at. um but before, like, they don't have any consent, they don't have any sort of line where they just say, I think the differences are really small. But like, again, they don't, there's no magnitude reference, right? Like what is like really small? Okay, so like what exists today, it could be 100% genetic, and that could be really small, right? So it's just yeah. So whenever they do that, and they always do that, whenever they do that, it's always like a reaction. It's always like a reaction to sort of like a quick escape from what their position really is, which is a morally driven, absolutist, and kind of bizarre exception, right? Where they say typically they tend to be evolutionists, obviously for every non-human, right? They tend to be fairly rational evolutionists for every non-human animal. But as soon as you look at humans, so one species for the brain, which isn't even one organ, it's one subsection of one organ. So for one species, for one subsection of one organ, that is where, and not just for humans in total, right, which would actually be a little bit better, but are going to be the same only for averages between populations, or very close to the same for averages between populations, not between any two individuals between these populations, only between the population averages are they going to be the same, right? Now, randomly selected population averages, yes, those can vary and do vary, right? But only, but when the categories that you're drawing the circle around happen to correspond to classically recognized races, then the averages, at least in terms of genetic potential or genetic tendency, not necessarily the final expression, but in terms of genetic tendency, they must be exactly the same. And when and so in order to preserve, it's bizarre, in order to preserve their belief in that, they can't accept they can't accept their belief really being described, and they'll deny that that's what they really believe, because it's absurd. Because and the reason that they can hold that absurd belief in their head for so long is because, first off, humans, they don't necessarily analyze every component of things that they believe. They don't analyze the chain, right? And so they don't analyze just how insanely unlikely that thing is. And it's really interesting and frustrating. And so you end up giving this absurd situation where describing their position in order to defend that position, which really is what they believe, they have to reject your frankly accurate description of their position because it's so absurd. And then they do like this band-aid, and it's always the same thing. It's the same because humans are very different, but they're not that different. It's always like, it's just to sort of backpedal and sort of mitigate the differences. Say it's a small difference, but like that small difference comes from nowhere. When they say, I think it's just a small difference, not like an absolute, iron law, the moral truth of equality is the same as descriptive reality itself, sort of thing. When they just back off of that and go to, I think the differences are really small, not that they're the same in toto, it's like that doesn't come from like where was that part of the doctrine, that they're not identical, they're just really small? No, all the doctrine of equality, it's all we're the same, we're the same, we're the same. And then once you lay out just how insanely, impossibly unlikely that is to be, it's just an immediate reflex to say, not totally the same, but really close, with no magnitude reference as to what really close is, right? So I don't know. I'm talking, so I'm trying to describe what's going on in my head, and I'm struggling. I'm really struggling because that really close thing, when they say, it's not identical but really close, that came after. That came later. That came once they were pressed. That was then sort of formed on the fly. Really close. They're not the same. They're really close. But there's no basis for the really close, right? Because the doctrine of equality is all about the same, right? So when pressed on how absurd like the sameness is, the idea of cognitive genetic equality in the brain between the races, how absurdly impossible that you know, only then is it no longer the same, it's really close or close enough, right? But at that point it's like, well, what really is your but when once they do that, once they've backed off of like the cosmic coincidence, right? Or what I forget who said it. I think maybe Lee Jasim or someone who called them cosmic egalitarians. Once you back off of cosmic equality, because as soon as because the moment cosmic equality is presented to them, which is what I just did about same in the one part of the brain for one species, blah blah blah. That's cosmic equality. As soon as cosmic equality is presented to them, they immediately recoil because as biased as they are, as soon as they get what cosmic equality is, as soon as they get it, as biased as they are, they're not gonna defend that, because to a certain extent your brain has to believe what, at least for most people. There are some people who are just total sociopaths who will just lie out their mouths forever, but to a certain extent you as a person have to believe your beliefs, right? You will defend your beliefs and you will make certain stretches here and there, but it all has to be there has to be a case for it somewhat. Like, you won't just, like, nobody is going to defend, or at least continue to believe, they may publicly continue to defend it for various reasons, but nobody's going to believe in like racial identicalness, you know, if they can't cobble together some plausible way that it's true in their own mind, right? Like people are not that brutish, right? They're not so brutish that they can just, make themselves believe, whatever is most convenient. There has to be there is some logic in man, right? And so they'll back off of cosmic equality. I keep trying to say this because I haven't verbalized it in a way that's satisfying to me. But hopefully, but I think I should just stop, because otherwise I'll just be looping forever. Yeah. So this sort of gets back a little bit to the truth towers, like, because this is something that I kind of discovered way back long ago. There's this guy Evogen. When I really began to realize that what most debunkings of evolution in humans, and they'll reject that label. They'll say, we're not debunking evolution in humans, we're something else, right? But basically the debate's about evolution. At heart, it's about evolution, and they're rejecting evolution in a very specific instance, right? But what I first figured out the phenomenon of reading the phone book, like way back in like 2011, 2012. This guy who's no longer around, Evogen. Because what I saw that he was doing is that he was basically listing off a whole bunch of like science facts and genetic facts or whatever that had nothing to do with anything that I said. And then like that debunked me. Now, Evogen did it in a very ham-fisted sort of way that eventually, even his viewers started to see was kind of BS. But what I've now come to realize is that that's in a way, obviously it's much more subtle and it's much more concealed than it was for Evogen, but in a way that's basically what all debunkings of HBD are, is that they're reading the phone book. They're saying a bunch of facts that are sort of within the same ballpark. They're sort of within the same topic of what the hereditarian is claiming, but they're not really, at least they're not really doing that. Now, interestingly enough, when you get away from molecular genetics and go back more towards more classical quantitative genetics, more like sort of environmental control studies and natural experiments and stuff like that, you actually, that's where this is not true. That's where you actually get a little bit more of egalitarians trying to address the hereditarians, trying to actually argue them. Unfortunately, well, fortunately or unfortunately, that is that's sort of been abandoned as kind of a field of argument, and I think it's because you know it's just been generally abandoned as a field of argument, and so that's where you got find the genes, because basically, um, egalitarians. I think we've all heard the story of Sandra Scar. She basically set up the Minnesota transracial adoption study as a way to try to like once and for all, like the final takedown of these evil racists and badism people, and set up the adoption study, which basically took a bunch of black, white, and mulatto kids and sent them to a bunch of adoptive families. And Sandra Scar at this point, um, she was definitely on the egalitarian side of things. So whether she said it or not, this study was clearly set up to prove, equality, right? To prove a kind of cosmic equality, or at least something like that. Now we know the results of the Minnesota transracial adoption study. You can look those up. It's very clear what happened. For a little while, Sandra Scar did try to sort of to spin her results in like an egalitarian way, but eventually she left the profession and is now a coffee farmer in Hawaii, believe it or not. That's kind of a shift in profession, but that's what she did. And I think that was basically, rightly or wrongly, I think that was sort of the end of really trying of the really sort of, I guess you would call it, head-on attacks on HBD. And later on, and so eventually most of the attacks sort of shifted into denial of biological race, gumming down with denial of IQ, even though IQ, like in academia itself, believe it or not, like as much shit as I give the truth towers, they're actually a little bit better on this. um, is that like in academia itself, IQ is not denied. IQ is like recognized as like one of the best, if not the best, like variable in all of social science. So like, I mean, it beats education level in basically everything in terms of predicting income. Um, Now, obviously, IQ does not beat education level in terms of educational attainment. I mean, that's kind of self-referential, but but your IQ is a better predictor of years in college than the amount of years in college your parents had. So, like, so anyway, that's one example where academics are actually a lot better than the average Joe. But increasingly, like out in the field, like the arguments against HBD, occasionally you'll find a guy who will like bring up Eifert or something, and that's pretty easy to show was it's not say what they think it says. Um, but mostly what I have found is that increasingly the race denial have been moving into find the genes. Like you need to find the actual genes that show this, which is bar raising crap that they never they first off, where was find the genes back in the 1970s when when these shitlibs, they all thought that like the adoption studies or like the factor analysis or changing in policy would show this to be true. Like they thought that this would be true sort of in like a bottom line manner, that this would all be actually shown, that this would all be shown to be, that you could do like an adoption study and it would show like the, or you could like, do a factor analysis, but ultimately the IQ gap would just outright close, right? Because cosmic equality is true, right? So the IQ gap will close, the environmental differences will be solved, and it just over time, like the truth of racial equality will manifest. like through a certain amount of affirmative action policies for a few years, just sort of, and of course it never happens, right? So that's why and the thing is, basically the failure of that, the failure of kind of like egalitarianism 1.0 has led to, first off, the change in the kinds of arguments they do against HPD, where they go more into like IQ, like denying denial of parameters, right? Denying race and denying IQ. And then raising the bar, find the so deny the parameters, raise the bar. That's basically what I think most arguments center around nowadays, right? As what in like, I remember in like a debate class I took that these would be called off case as opposed to on case arguments. Denial of the parameters themselves are like off case. So they're shifting more and more to off case arguments. And also in terms of trying to explain, you know, the failure of the 1960 of basically civil rights, of the civil rights project, you know, because we're getting to 58 years now, right? This is not, these things are not theoretical anymore, right? You know, and you can't say they haven't gotten their way in terms of affirmative action and getting the banks to loan to blacks and certainly at the low level, like the interpersonal interactions with blacks. First off, I don't think that was ever really true. And I don't believe people who go, I was there and I believe it was true, because I've seen too many, I've read too much about memory to believe people who were around in the 50s and 60s to say blacks were treated badly back then. I don't, sorry, I don't trust your memory, right? I've read too much I've read too much about the modification of memory, and you know, and I've listened to too many Holocaust testimonials, okay, to trust memory, especially for events long ago. But that's where like all these increasingly exotic arguments about white privilege, I think they came about sort of as a way to try to explain what's happening, you know, after 58 years, right? Because you get further and further away, it's like it's more and more like, you know, and this is sort of the fork in the road, right? Like it's okay, so it's been 58 years, what's going on? Now, the most parsimonious answer, of course, is it was genes all along, and you're trying to solve. It's not, if it's genes all along, then there's not there's not even a problem, and there's nothing to solve, right? There's no problem to solve. People just are what they are, right? So that's the one fork is like, yeah, it's been genes this whole time, and the other fork is the white supremacism oppression is far deeper and greater than we ever imagined it to be back in the 60s. And unfortunately, that's where most are going. But I think there is an opportunity there with like the increasingly exotic and disconnected. And the thing is, I think this Memphis shooting is sort of like a kind of flash to the public of what's going on. Because you saw people like further up in the truth tower, in news organizations and universities, a guy like Tim Wise, for example, said like, yeah, these black cops who beat to death a black criminal suspect, whatever, a guy the cops were after, they beat him to death. And that's an example of internalized white supremacy. Now, back in like, you know, 1973 or something, that would just be, you're insane. That's what? There's no evidence. What? That just made that up like that. And you're seeing sort of the public reaction to that on Twitter. It's very hostile, very negative. Like, whoa, but that is a really exotic argument, and that's what I mean when I say that as like the traditional argument started to fade away. I think the sort of what you would call the transition zone when academia started moving into the exotics, right? Just before like the popularization of like sort of a vague and ethereal white privilege that's just sort of there in the air. It was stereotype threat. Um, I forget the name. I think it was another guy. Last name was Steele. But yeah, I think it was stereotype threat, and the stereotype threat studies that like, oh, you know, black people in particular, but also they talked about other groups. They do worse on tests when they feel that they do worse on tests. And of course, I've gone over how that's not true. Short course is that you'll get a stereotype threat effect if the test is of low stakes, but the thing is you can't produce a stereotype threat effect even if there are some stakes in any like real world results. Um, like another thing is like you'd expect to see more variation in real world results because you'd expect to see variation in stereotype threat. There were like natural experiments for like the SAT, like say what your race is and all that. And those produced no result, whether the person had to state their race or not, produced no effect on the score. And so basically stereotype threat, it can be produced in a lab. No evidence has been shown outside of a lab. The lab results were also overstated. And another thing, there were stereotype threat effects that were done where they actually paid the person a certain amount of money based on how many questions they got right on the thing. And so the way the study was set up, it was done regarding on women. I hope they did one on blacks, but they did one on women. And basically, the woman got a big lecture about how women are dumb. You woman, you're really, really stupid. Here's the scientific evidence that you're like really, really stupid. All right, here's a test. We'll give you like $5 for every correct answer you get. And they compared this to the women who they did not give this your stupid presentation, and the scores were no different, right? However, when they did this same tests, but they didn't pay them for results, the women who got the your stupid presentation, they did worse. But as soon as there was money on the line, suddenly no stereotype threat. Suddenly, when it matters, stereotype threat effects go away. They only exist when they don't matter, right? Which is kind of like I forget there was this movie, but there was this one character, black character, but he was but I liked it because his superpower was like a stupid like spoof superpower movie, but his superpower was that he's invisible, but only when nobody's looking. And that's like stereotype. Now the plot twist, which is actually makes it more funny, is that it was actually true, and they actually got through some laser beam something by using his power of invisibility, but they couldn't look at him because it would be invisible. But anyway, that was but that's kind of like stereotype threat. It's like it exists, but only when it doesn't matter. That's stereotype threat. But that sort of was sort of the bridge between what I would call the I guess you would call more human objections. Like you believe in the equality, so you do the kinds of studies to try to show the equality, right? Right. That seems pretty straightforward. And obviously, over time, right, as racism, quote unquote, goes away, and you start propping blacks up a little bit for a while, then you'll start to get the equality, and race will become sort of a superficial thing and a figment of the past, right? But as those as that failed, right? As we would all predict, as that failed, stereotype threat, what it was, I think, sort of the beginning of the move into the exotic, right? Because poverty, because now in the public, this is the same thing is kind of true like with the Holocaust. Like there's kind of the public debate and then there's the academic debate. With the public, like things like poverty are still arguments made by the public. In academia, they're not made anymore, because like the poverty argument just does not work in several ways, and it's also very very quickly shot down in public debates as well. The poverty argument. So poverty that was one of like the earliest ones, and that just completely failed as an explainer. But those are like the kinds of arguments that I would call the pre-exotics, and then you got stereotype threat, which bridge the gap between pre-exotics and the exotics. And exotics, well, an exotic would be like, well, just what happened recently in Memphis. Like the black cops killed the black suspect, because they were fueled by white supremacy, right? That's exotic. And it's going to get more and more exotic and more crazy the further and further you get from 1965. Because the further you get from 1965, the more they have to explain a genetic phenomena using environment, right? Like trying to explain variation in, like, imagine trying to explain variation in agricultural yields without reference to any of the inherent characteristics of the soil, and being like, well, look, the reason that we can't grow apple orchards in like the dead middle of the Sahara, well, let's look at irrigation for apple orchards in England or something. Here's like the extensive irrigation system used for apple orchards in England. Okay, where are the irrigation networks for apple orchards in the Sahara? Oh, none. They don't exist, and you're surprised that they don't grow in the Sahara, right? And that's kind of what they're trying to do. Basically, the race denier people, the whole shindig and the whole civil rights grift, the whole religion around that. They're basically having to explain. You know what? Here's a better example. It's like trying to explain why they couldn't grow grain in Kazakhstan in the Soviet Union. That's what it's kind of like. And then over time, you know, as the policy, like as they continually fail to grow grain in like southern Kazakhstan, northern Kazakhstan they can grow. And so why can't we grow grain in southern Kazakhstan? All the irrigation, it's not working. All the none of the stuff, the new fertilizers that we're doing, the new crop rotations, are doing all these things. None of it's working. And so what do? Do you say, look, the genetics of the soil of southern Afghanistan don't lend themselves to grain production, right? Now, obviously, the Soviet Union, they figured it out a lot more because land and yield and crop yield is not a religiously, emotionally resonating topic as equality in the brain for the races is in the West. But that's what it's kind of like. And so it's just going to get crazier and crazier and crazier the further away you get from 1965. And because the further away you get to 1965, the more genetic phenomena you have to explain through non-genetic means. And so it just gets bigger and bigger and more complex and more exotic, and there's more deep truths that you have to learn, right? It's not straightforward. And so it ends up being this giant, enormous, counterintuitive lie posing as a counterintuitive truth. So that's what I'm saying. Okay, so I've been rambling for a long time. Maybe I should read like what some of the chat bros are saying on I guess I'll look at YouTube here. Actually, I read the white power chat here. From Eski, $3. How could the function of any two things be the same if they are different sizes? Well, yeah, I basically don't think they could be. Most people don't. In fact, that's something Stephen Jay Gould, Eski, when Stephen Jay Gould was doing his thing, basically denying race differences in brain size, which of course later been refuted by modern MRI analyses done that basically say, yeah, all the guys Gould was talking about, they correctly measured it. Gould was, I mean, they don't say Gould is a liar, but basically that's how we know Gould was a liar. But I forget what phrase he used. Something somethingology recapitulates tautology or something. But basically, what he was saying was that um, if the brains are the same, like on the surface, like physiologically, like if they're the same size, if they have the same basic structure. Now, obviously, at the time Gould was doing this, he couldn't look at same basic structures. He could only look at volume. But basically, his argument was if they're the same basic volume, they probably do the same thing. Now, the inverse of that, I think he would accept, right? Which is if they're of different volumes, they probably don't do the same thing. I mean, that's pretty, like what you're saying, SG, is basically like, yeah, like most people get that intuitively, though they may try to find ways around that, SG. So, all right. Anyway, that was my, let's see. Did I write anything else down? So like going back to this, like to do a debunking of hereditarianism, let me debunk hereditarianism. Let me this is every debunking of hereditarianism, right here. I'm going to debunk all of it. Science, 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 racism is bad and wrong. And the thing is, you can, somebody who's like hostile to me or whatever, they can laugh and dismiss that all you want. But if you don't actually understand what's being said, like how different really, how different is a long phone book reading debunking post on Reddit, for example, or even stupider and more posturing an academic journal article, very little of which you understand at all. You just sort of see the title of the speaker, the fantasy structure of authority, right? Numbers and citations you assume are relevant, you hope are relevant. But if you don't actually understand it, then it's not functionally different than some guy coming out of the closet, putting on the hat that says expert. He puts on a hat with in marker across the hat, says expert, comes out, stands in front of you, and says, science, 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 racism is bad and wrong. I mean, if you think otherwise, like, okay, like if you don't understand it, then they might as well be just saying science, science, science. If you don't understand it, that is what they're saying to you, as far as you're concerned. Right? They're just doing, So, and look, at all times in human existence, some religion or another has dominated. Right? Human existence is racked with religion or blessed with religion, whichever way you want to put it. Okay. Most of human religion is not nearly as theistic as Christianity or Islam. Like Confucianism, Taoism, Hinduism, depending on the sect, Buddhism, right? These were all less theistically bound or dependent on divine revelation as the Abrahamic religions were, right? So this idea that religion is something theistic, it has to be based on divine connection or something. This is a very Abrahamically biased idea. Right. This is not nearly so much the case in China, right? Where their religion and religions were not nearly as hard divinely based. So for outside of the Abrahamic world, talking about something that's purely secular, like like Marxism, for example, is easy to fit into this category. To say that that's a religion, like that's you may have, you being from an Abrahamic tradition for whom religion is theism, right? That's a big leap for you than for somebody who was in China, where like Confucianism was a big thing, which is like far less theistic, or perhaps even atheistic entirely, depending on stuff. So the whole dropping of God, like, okay, defining religion as theism is like defining drugs as crack cocaine. Like, like say you have a guy who's like has like a hyper addictive personality, gets hooked on cocaine, and then you get him off cocaine, and it's like, well, now we've conquered drugs. Meanwhile, he gets over here, he gets hooked on heroin, right? Or or like the move between traditional cigarettes and vaping, for example. Although I think even in that example, I think vaping is probably a lot better for you than traditional cigarettes. But it's kind of like that. Now, of course, a religion today like isn't going to name itself, right? Because like solid concrete names, they just give a religion like a big target. And the evolution of religions doesn't have to be like centrally planned. It's just sort of what works, right? Like um and that's the hell of all of this is that there's not there could be, but there doesn't have to be any one guy who's centrally planning like here's how all the here's how we're gonna deal with HBD going forward. Here's how we're gonna deal with like COVID skeptics going forward, right? Or not COVID skeptics, vaccine skeptics going forward, right? It can just sort of be what works or what arguments people like to make, right? Tend to be those that end up being made, um, and so in terms of organizations that persist, it's just those that persist. And so a religion today, in the past, like in a really low information environment, like take like you're in the Roman Empire, very rural, very spread out, information doesn't get very far very fast. So in that environment where getting a basic understanding of what the religion even is, that was a significant barrier then. Yeah, tagging your religion as a concrete thing had more benefits, right? Because here's the thing, here's the text, right? The text may be very big, but at least it's one thing and it's all in one place, right? But nowadays, like with the internet, and even before the internet, when you had more and more mass media, concretizing the religion just makes you an identifiable target, right? It makes you less amorphous. Whereas, the more mass media you have, the better off you are not giving yourself a name. So, all right, that was decided I wanted to stream. I wasn't particularly well prepared. Uh, I just decided to talk for a little while because I wanted to talk, and that was uh that was what I wanted to talk about. All right, so let me go ahead and look at the chatters or say. Do I have any viewers even? I have some viewers. I have 200 on YouTube. I probably have some on Cozy. I'm not checking Cozy. Let's see. Great stream. Counterintuitive sometimes just means obviously wrong. Solid stream, bro. I guess. Vaping can congest your lungs nearly as bad. The glycerin that's used as substrate is like a plastic and will bind to your lungs. Ooh. Yeah, I just don't smoke. I think the actual viewer count on YouTube is much higher than listed. Yeah, who knows? I doubt it. I'm not in the rise. You have as many viewers on Cozy as here. Okay. So, another streamer estimated there's 3 times as many as the listed number. Maybe. Who knows? I don't know. I don't know if my channel is big enough anymore for it to be. I peaked at 300 on Cozy. Cool. All the viewers. Not that many viewers. Good night, bros. You know what? I think you're right. Ryan, we're having our second born son tomorrow morning. Congratulations. It's fantastic. Carman Mercada. Yeah, so the stream is basically over now. Ryan, can I name my son after you? Sure. I mean, I don't think people are gonna really get it. Ryan. I mean, it's a pretty common name. For 11 years ago, my first experience with cannabis was walking past fields of it while on patrol in Afghanistan. This video adds a new dimension to those memories of mine. Really? What? What video? Video. Any future COVID streams planned? What new info, really? I mean, I think most of the relevant info, I mean, it's just going to take time for, like, it's going to take time for more confirmation of what the guy said. Like the black guy who got, I guess, catfished into saying, like, yeah, we're editing the virus. Like, he's just, I don't know, he's just, he, I mean, there's a possibility, I don't think this is the case, but there's a possibility that he said that to impress his date. It's a possibility, you know. Um, obviously, however, obviously, this stuff he said, like in a sane society, this stuff would be like, okay, now we need to do a massive, like, you know, spread them open wide Pfizer, and also we're gonna be like looking into stuff at Pfizer to then perhaps go spread it open wide Johnson and Johnson. Who else is doing that, right? So, in an ideal world, this would be the impetus to a massive, like, the ass investigation of like every company involved in this. Okay, in an ideal world. Unfortunately, they may be protected institutionally, and if they're being protected from any from the proper up the ass investigation that they deserve, then this may be like, I don't know, this may be a justified example of direct action. And it's unfortunate because direct action would have to be taken. I need to say this kind of in passive tense here, kind of in passive voice. Direct action would have to be taken with incomplete information, and that's not fun. So, yeah, I guess that's just sort of how. Did you voice a section in The Greatest Story Never Told? No. That was just a clip that somebody took from one of my videos. He's like the real life race realist Sheldon Cooper. Oh, no, you haven't seen. The real Sheldon Coopers don't do streams or videos or anything like that. Well, frankly, Sheldon Cooper is kind of a meme, but he's actually a lot less autistic than a lot of people in the real world. He's a lot more socially. First off, Sheldon Cooper doesn't seem to have social anxiety, like really at all. At least not no more than the average person does. So he's just socially, you know what he's like? He's socially unaware but lacks social anxiety, and that's what makes him funny, right? Because he's not like a shrinking violet. He just says what he's thinking, which is like kind of, you know, absurd in one way, but like makes a lot of sense, you know, if you're not a human. Opinions on ecological overshoot. Look it up. Okay, I'll look it up. Ecological overshoot. Yeah, social anxiety wouldn't make for good TV. Someone needs to do a deep dive on Khazaria. I've basically come to the conclusion that Khazaria is like the whole Jewish Khazaria thing is like not true, but maybe not. Maybe I'm reacting too quickly to that. But is it Sean or Ryan who is more heavy set? I had dinner with them once. I'm trying to Sean or Ryan. I doubt you had dinner with me, Christoph Dallas. I don't remember if I had dinner with anyone with Sean. But no, Sean is he's definitely a lot bigger. Like I'm 5'7", he's like 6'4", 5. After consulting 30 medical professionals to confirm cannabis is a link to violent crime, 29 of 30 of them said there was no connection. That's kind of what you're talking about. Treat all peoples equally or whatever is the war on drugs. Basically, the war on drugs, I think, was developed at first as like kind of a Minority Report sort of thing, where is it What was that movie where they're trying to get where they basically bust criminals before they commit the crime? That's kind of what the war on drugs was like, because I think what they did was they found certain substances that people who do real crimes tend to use a lot, and back when they were actually back when back when the federal government was actually interested in reducing crime, they thought, well, what we should do is find these things that are good predictors for real crime, lock them up before they ever even commit a crime, and that will drastically reduce crime. And they did, and it worked. It worked. Anyone who says the war on drugs didn't work, it absolutely worked. Not against drugs, like that's stupid. Like but it absolutely worked in reducing crime. Because all these people, like let's say you take everybody who has like, like let's say people who do crack have a 50% chance of committing some sort of violent crime in their lifetime. You bust them up, you bust them on crack, and say you put them in prison for like 15 years. That's 15 years where there's no chance of them doing a violent crime, at least not to anybody you care about. They can do a crime to somebody who's in prison or something. So it works, right? Now, the problem, of course, is that you end up jailing a lot of people who never would have committed a violent crime. But, oh well, they've committed the crime of doing crack cocaine, right? So that I think was the real motivation and point of drugs. And that's also why I think there was a lot of a push to like the DARE program was done, and I think it was more biased towards like white suburban households, basically saying, don't get caught up in the war on drugs dragnet, please. If obviously they couldn't say that. They couldn't say that the war on drugs was about putting criminals in jail before they committed a real crime, because that's people won't accept that. But and I think that and anyway, the legalization of marijuana occurred once you started to get a lot more white middle class people doing marijuana. And so I think that basically the connection between marijuana usage and real crime collapsed. Like back when it was back when marijuana was more of a Hispanic thing, basically what you're doing when you arrest and jail a marijuana user, at a certain time, you are basically jailing a kind of lower class Hispanic person. Right? That's basically what you're getting when you jailed a marijuana user, like in the 40s or something. And that is going to have a detrimental, that is going to reduce crime, because when you just put lower class Hispanic people in jail, they're more criminal than the average person. You're going to reduce crime by doing that. But as soon as marijuana became more generally accepted, I think there's still probably some connection between marijuana use and crime, but I don't think it's enough to really do it. And obviously alcohol, no. Like even alcohol almost certainly has a better connection between crime, a better connection to criminal behavior than marijuana, but you're never going to have that's my take on the war on drugs. Ryan, should I drop out of university? No, get that apple. Get that. I would recommend getting a degree in something you enjoy doing. Don't just like and use your university courses and classes and all the goodies you get at a university. You get like a computer lab. I don't know if you get like free supplies. You get you get a certain room and board. You get all sorts of goodies at a university, just kind of from the economies of scale that you can then use to do stuff. So no, I would stay in university, get that credential, get that invisible apple. Employers will value it. Even if it just makes it a little bit easier to get a job at like that shouldn't require a degree at all, it's still worth it. And you get that period when you're at the university where you get access to all that equipment. And like for example, university presentations, if there's ever something where you get to do a presentation, you get a captive audience right there of people that are not, and like I have 222 people watching right now. But like the reason like people like Richard Spencer went to universities was because those are people that are not like already sort of aligned with him, or for whatever reason interested in hearing what he has to say. So, yeah. Remember the Cold War? Yeah, it's happening today. Remember King Leopold? That's King Leopold was freaking amazing. Like with 200 guys, he was able to to kill 10 million Congolese, because there was no more than like 200 guys, 200 Europeans in the Congo at any one time, and yet they managed to kill 10 million. I mean, that is like a KD ratio. Oh, out of this world. How did they do that? Now, there are some people, like Ryan Falk tries to say things like there's no way they killed that many people. In fact, there's evidence that the population of the Congo, what is now the Congo, actually grew when Leopold was ruling them. But they're just trying to deny the just what a badass King Leopold was. How he could get what is that? What's like 200 to 10 million? What is that for a KD ratio? What would that be? Obviously, it didn't happen. But like, what would it be if like the meme was true? It's 10 million. 50,000 to 1. Actually, well, I don't know how many of them died though. If all of them died, if all of them were killed in their genocide campaign, that would be 50,000 to 1, but I don't know how many of them were actually killed in the Congo. So, but if all of them were killed, that's what I'll say. The lowest KD ratio they could have had was 50,000 to 1, but it was probably higher than that because they weren't, very few of them were killed. If 10 of them were killed, it'd be like 20 times that, so 50 times. It'd be like 1,000,000 to 1. Should I go back to finish my degree? Depends on how long it is. Online schooling lockdown didn't agree with me. Well, I don't know, man. Obviously, your degree should be like, I don't know, man. Like if I was to do it over again, get a degree, I would be like very financially oriented in the degree. Is this degree gonna make me money? Right. That's what I would be focused on. And you know, there's just recognizing there's no truth here. Where's the money? Like I'm here to get a credential, to that to get an invisible apple that employers will pay me more for. And that's what you need to do. Like whatever your job, whatever your field is, whatever your work is, get the degree in that. Don't think about it's not something that is like good in itself. I'm literally one class away from a degree, Spanish language number 2, required by school. Maybe I should get it done before they increase requirements. Yes, slots, you should. I mean, if it's one class, like you're getting that invisible apple at the cost of one class. The invisible apple may not be worth all the things you have to do, but if it's just one class for the invisible apple, freaking do it at this point. Okay, so I would have had dinner with them that one time with Ryan, not Sean. I doubt it. I mean, Sean is like way big. Like I'm 5'7". He's like 6'4" or 5. And he's big. He's like 300 pounds big, right? And he's kind of fat, but at that height. But he's also tall and has a lot of muscle, and he's fat. So you would be able to, so Christoph Dallas, you'd be able to tell the difference. And I think it was Sean. I don't think it was me, right? You would not confuse us. Believe me. In the flesh, you would not confuse us. The degree would be in a STEM in the natural resources sector. I guess. Look, I don't want to give life advice because I didn't get a good degree, and I don't get good jobs. How does one reach out to you? Just DM me on Twitter. Like just DM, that's how you can talk to me. Stefan Kuzoya. No, no, Kyle. The funny hats are what you get from graduation. The degree is the invisible app. Yes, yes, yes. I'm Ryan Falk. Chris Dallas. Is Sean a football player? No. He could be. He could have been, but he had the body for it. But I don't think he ever would. All right. All right. I think that's enough for the stream now. You're gonna transition at 5'6". Ryan, do you kill loot bugs? I don't know what's a loot bug. Ryan, when were you diagnosed with autism? Would you still do the debunking of Stefan Molyneux today? Less so, because Molyneux has a lot less to debunk today. Like the stuff that I debunked Molyneux about was more like the was what I would call like the new libertarian man. So I don't think there's so much to disagree with Molyneux at this point. I understand that it's a way to get traffic to like lash out at somebody who has a lot of viewers or who you look at and they say they could be viewers because our content is similar, but here's a disagreement that I have with Molyneux, so I'm going to go after Molyneux to try to get his viewers, right? I understand that, but Molyneux is not saying Molyneux is not pushing the new libertarian man stuff anymore about like the peaceful parenting crap. Interesting, interesting. That happened sort of around the time that he had his kid. Interesting. Now that I think of it, I didn't make that connection before, but now, you know, interesting. He had the kid, then suddenly the peaceful parenting stuff went away. It's kind of funny. Um, has Stefan created anything worth catching up on? Um, I don't know. I don't know if he does. He may. He's a good framer, I think. Kind of like me. I think of myself as a good framer, and I think he's a good framer too. He might have something to say, but I'll just say this: back when he was in new libertarian man mode, where I thought we're going to create the new libertarian man through peaceful parenting, um, I don't think back then I thought he had a little bit of interesting stuff to say for a little while, but then I started to like. But then once we got into the free will debate and the objective morality debate and the UPB stuff, that's when I lost. Um, like in terms of like who am I going to spend time reading on like things that are not that are actually important. Like at the time, it was like the stateless society is really important, and the technical reality of that. What will it look like? What are some objections to it? You know, are these objections valid or not? Like those sorts of questions I was having back then. I sort of lost interest in Molyneux answering those questions based on his new libertarian man psychology, his belief in objective morality, and um, and his belief in free will. Those things made me go, okay, I can't really trust his judgment very much. That doesn't mean he's going to be wrong on every technical thing he says, but in terms of where I'm going to spend, in terms of who I'm going to spend my time listening to, not really time, but more effort listening to, because you could just sit back and have some guy ramble on a stream and not really pay much attention, you know. And so, but there's only so much, you know, listening energy that you have. I'm going to spend that listening energy on someone else, right? So that's why I kind of that was my experience with Molyneux. What is your paternal haplogroup? Paternal haplogroup. That would be uh, Ulster Scott. Maternal would be just no, no that no, okay. Paternal is Norwegian. Maternal is Ulster Scot. Have you read Viktor Suvorov? He wrote interesting books. Yeah, I read through. I read Suvorov a while ago. I read Suvorov. Age reverse when distortion. Age reverse now. Age reverse now. Now the thing is, age reverse now. Sort of. I should do a stream. I should do another anti-aging stream because that's something people care about, and that's something that you can actually listen to what I have to say, and you'll actually like learn things that'll actually be useful. We interviewed 305 of the use approximately 1 year later and found the drug use and delinquency persisted, in some case increased over time. I don't know who don't blame me for. I thought Ryan was largely of Irish descent. No, sort of. I mean, Ulster Scot, like that's Northern Ireland. That's basically what happened is when the English took over Ireland. A whole bunch of settlers from Scotland and England went into Ireland. The Scots settled in Northern Ireland, which is now very different from the rest of Ireland, right? And the English settled around the Dublin area, right, sort of in the center east coast of Ireland. The English wanted to settle there because they wanted to make money on growing grain, because bread was a big money making. Because this is what people don't realize is that grain was actually once Europe got access to the potato, that basically replaced grain as like the food crop for the masses, right? The potato basically became the go-to food crop for the masses because its calorie per acre year was like 3 times that of wheat. But wheat obviously makes bread. You can make potato bread, but it's not very good. Like wheat, it was like actually became like the luxury. It was not a staple crop. It was like something that you ate if you were rich. If you were rich, you got to eat bread, right? Now before this, back before Europe had discovered the potato, everyone was eating grain and everyone was eating bread. But then you got like different cuts of bread. That's where the term upper crust and lower crust comes from. But anyway, but at this time, the potato was set in Europe, and potato was basically the food crop for the poor. Grain was for the rich. Basically, the English settlers, they all wanted to grow grain to make money off of Ireland. What they found was that Ireland was not good for grain, at least the area that they were in, sort of around the Dublin Pale. And the Scottish settlers, however, were just fine. They were perfectly fine growing potatoes. And that's why the Ulster Scots are there and the English just kind of left. That's the story. The English left because they couldn't grow grain. Whereas my ancestors were perfectly happy growing potatoes. Could you beat Jared Taylor in a fight, Ryan? That's stupid. Yes. I mean, that's stupid, dude. I'm like I'm a big guy. I'm like right now, like I'm fat right now, so I'm like 190 pounds right now, but like I should weigh 160. And I'm like 5'7", and like when I was in high school and I was wrestling, I wrestled at the 171 weight class. So like I'm a big guy. I'm short, but I'm a dwarf. I'm not a hobbit. So and Jared Taylor's whole stop with this. I love Jared Taylor. Like Jared Taylor's a great guy. Makes great arguments. He's done great work. A lot. I if I had to guess, I'd guess that I actually repeat a lot of the things that I got from him unknowingly, right? Like I don't like I would never like not give Jared Taylor credit for something intentionally, but I probably do it unintentionally quite a bit. So I don't want to fight. Why would I fight Jared Taylor? Silly. Yeah, Jared Taylor's my favorite Japanese man. Langus is good. Have you ever had potato pancakes, Ryan? Yes, I have. Yes, I have. 50 push-ups isn't a lot, to be honest. Short people usually marry later. Yeah. Or not at all. Short people also live longer, all else being equal. Um, Shorter women definitely live longer. I think shorter men, although then again, shorter men are often like depressed for being short, which is not the case for me. But but I know like the physiologically, it's easier to sort of do cell repair on like well, just it's easier to do cell repair on a smaller body, but even for a given size, for some reason, it's easier to do cell repair and like for a shorter body because apparently it has something to do with circulation. Like even if you're like the same like total mass of like total muscle mass, bone mass, but it's like squished down into a shorter height. Apparently, blood flow is easier when you're squished down or something, so that helps. But anyway, um, could you beat PPP? I saw a picture of BPP. He is huge. Like he is a big guy. I don't know. You have wrestling training and he has a bad knee. I mean, I don't know. The problem is when you get it when you're that fat, it's really hard to assess how strong they are when they're that fat. Because like the fattiness in PPP's arms, it could go all the way to the bone, or there could be you don't know how much muscle there is in between the fat and the arm, right? When they're that fat. So I have no idea how strong PPP is. I don't know what his weight, quote unquote. I don't know what's PPP's wrestling weight. Like I apparently PPP's 320 right now. So his wrestling weight could be anything between like 160 and 240, right? Depending. So I don't know how. So it'd be a hard guess. If PPP was like under 200 for his like for what his wrestling weight should be, I suspect I could take him just because I know how to fight. But if he's above that, that if they get above that, then the physical advantages start to just overwhelm. There's a lot of money underneath all that fat. Yes, there is. Yes, there is. Oh, okay. White John for $10. Send some donos, you cheap faggots. I'm gonna be streaming further. And last stream I got like 240, so don't worry, guys, about sending money, especially for this stream, which was kind of like spur of the moment, and just I wrote some stuff down, so now I'm talking. Don't feel pressured about that. Plus, there's like subscribe people, so and I get some money from that, and I work as well, like if you guys didn't notice. So don't feel too much pressure on that. Obviously, it helps and it makes it easier for me to do less work, like the world, less wage slavery. But yeah. So anyway, anonymous for $3. I was looking at that rapper Machine Kelly. He seemed to me to fit the profile of the worst kind of shit lib. Is he like? Is that like worst of both worlds? So like Afro lover, whatever. Anyway, if you look into his parents, they were both devout religious missionaries. Machine. Okay, I'm interested in this. Who is Machine Kelly? Who's Machine Kelly? Let me look up Machine Kelly. Actually, I can put this on the I can actually start to do some. Machine Kelly. Oh. uh, look at it. The first thing, and it's like, where did the chat go? The chat went away. Okay, there you are. But yeah, the first thing, Machine Kelly, and it's just like this sexual. Uh, oh, Rap Devil. Okay, so this guy sucks. This guy's terrible. Well, Machine Kelly. Or Machine Gun Kelly, whatever. Taller people are subconsciously socially favored. Yes, they are. I'm sure that's someone's fetish. That's quite a few people's fetish, buddy. It's like 1 in 4 people have like a foot fetish, and so probably like, so it's like the most common fetish. To the degree that I'm surprised it got on the front page, actually. He wishes with all his heart that he were. That's the tale of the wigger. That's the tale. There are some this like wigger group that grew up around me. This was in the 90s. No, no, it wasn't. This was like in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002 or something. It's like 12 or something. Yeah, they're guys like this group of guys. They were just obsessed. They loved Eminem, and they straight up said, "I wish I were black." Right, and even then, even before like any like knowledge about that or any kind of racial idea at all, like talking like not necessarily rural, but not quite urban, sort of. I guess we'll call it towny, sub-rural. I think that's the term, sub-rural Kansas. Like even then, when I had no ideas about like you know different races or anything. I didn't think of that in those terms at all. I thought, oh, there's something wrong with you. Like even then, like I didn't think about it much at all, about race much at all. They said, "I wish I were black." I said, I told them, "There's something wrong with you. That's not right. Like you shouldn't think that way." Now I have more of an understanding of where that pathology comes from. Why weaker minds would fall into that. Yeah, Eminem. Yeah, short men, tall women equal healthy relationship. I had a story about that. Like it doesn't involve me, believe it, but yeah, there was this girl who said that she would, and she was actually kind of tall. She was like 5'9" or something. And she was saying that she could never date like a guy shorter than him or shorter than her, and and anyway, but she ended up going to the dance with a guy who was actually like slightly shorter than me. So I forget what dance it was. He had all these little stupid little dances. They weren't stupid. They were enjoyable. I liked them. They were silly. How tall are you? 5'7". 5'7". That's how tall I am. I think it's time to end the stream. I'm going to do the streams more going forward. I got some time a little bit off of work is going to be less of an issue a little bit, so I have more time to devote to these sorts of things and make some better streams with maybe some stuff on screen other than like the images that I put together. So that'll be that. And I think that'll end the stream, guys.